Hey everyone, it's Alan Schimmel, and you're watching TechStrong TV for today, August 31st. It's hard to believe that August is gone and tomorrow starts September. When this whole COVID thing had started, for us in early March, we sent everyone home from the office. I remember singing to myself the song "Wake Me When September Comes," and I really felt certain that by September we'd have this under control. And with over 1,000 people and more dying in the U.S. every day from COVID and COVID-related sickness, we really don't have it under control. And in spite of what some politicians wanting us to ignore it or think we have it under control or it's going to go away, it's not. And this is why you're probably watching this from home. And no one here is in our office other than me and my video producer, Paul Gustafson. But nevertheless, a bright spot in all this has been the resilience of tech, right? The internet stays up, our applications stay up. As a matter of fact, we are probably doing more on the internet and with, on online applications and online living for a lot of us than we have ever done before. And it's a testament, I think, to the technology industry and what we've done. And a lot of that is due to cloud transformation, digital transformation, DevOps, and of course cyber, cloud native technologies, open source. They've all contributed to allow us to function day to day. And that's what we talk about here at TechStrong TV, right? We try to focus on the positive of all of the great things going on in the tech world. We talk to people from all over the world about these things, and hopefully you get a little education and stay informed as well and entertained. And that's why we do the show. By the way, this is episode 85 of TechStrong TV. So welcome. We have a good show lined up today. Let me tell you what I've got in store for you. Number one, we have an interview with Akash Tayai. And if I mispronounce, I apologize. But he is a cloud strategy leader at Deloitte. And we're going to talk about just what I just told you about tech's resilience and adaptation and adoptions, and how this tech revolution we've seen in the light of COVID-19 has really been a game changer in many ways. Then we're going to talk to my friend Dan Garfield over at CodeFresh. Dan is someone we've interviewed many times. And CodeFresh just has a new survey out with some great results around Kubernetes adoption and DevOps adoption and more, CI/CD. So we'll talk to Dan and get the scoop on that. Then I'm happy to be joined once again by Susan St. Clair of Checkmarx. And, Checkmarx is a leader in application security scanning. And they've really become a leader and have put in a lot of effort in their open source, or as some call it now, open source component, or SCA, software composition analysis capabilities. And Susan's going to talk to us about that and why, in light of COVID and rapid application development, SCA is more and more important than ever. Then we're going to go do something old, again from our TechStrong Con, and I'm going to replay something. I think we've replayed it once before, but it's really one of my favorite sessions at TechStrong Con, and it's from the one and only Cornelia Davis, who's a rock star. If you've never heard or seen Cornelia, please search her on YouTube or whatever for yourselves to find out. But anyway, we are going to talk to Cornelia Davis. Well, we're not going to talk to her. She's presenting. And this was from TechStrong.com. But it's about GitOps. And what is it and why is it important to you? And she's going to talk about the principles of it and how these practices, if you embrace them, can help you. So it's a bit long. It's almost an hour presentation, but well worth the time and a great presentation. After Cornelia's presentation, though, I will be back with the news later. And then we're going to hand things over to Charlene O'Hanlon, our managing editor. And Charlene has Larry Gordon, co-founder, CEO of XOps, on today about the importance of inclusions and diversity in technology environments. and it's not just in technology environments, but certainly we should start there. And then we have a webinar preview of all the great webinars we're doing at MediaOps this week by Charlene. And then I'll be back to hand things over to Mike Vizard. We have another channel roundup with Mike, and this one is with the StackRock CEO, where we discuss the challenges around container security. Then we have a Mitch, Analyst Corner with Mitchell Ashley, co-founder, CEO at Accelerated Strategies Group. And then after that, I'll be back to wrap things up. It's a great day in the MediaOps neighborhood, and it's a great day to have you with us on TechStrong TV. We're going to take a quick break right now for a sponsor's word, and I'll be back with our first guest.
Join topic experts and peers for a Splunk virtual event. Observability to enable your digital initiatives. Are your apps and services distributed in the cloud, getting refactored as microservices, or becoming more complex? If they are, you must factor in observability. Observability is all your data to help you find unexpected failure conditions, explain why they happen, and resolve them fast. This event is about the challenges, opportunities, and best practices to successfully build observability into everything you develop, deliver, or monitor. Register today.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, our first guest today is Akash Tyal. He's a cloud strategy leader at Deloitte, and we're going to talk about tech resilience, adaptation and cloud adoption, and how it's been sort of a new tech revolution over the last 6 months that was brought on as a result of the COVID-19 situation. And you know what? It's not going to go away when COVID is more under control. I think we're going to build off of it. And if there's a silver lining in all of this, this may very well be it. So here's my conversation with Akash Tyal.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on another segment here on TechStrong TV. Our guest this segment is Akash Tyal from Deloitte Cloud, of course part of Deloitte. And Akash, welcome to TechStrong TV.
Thank you, Alan.
So Akash, let's jump right into it. I introduced you as being part of Deloitte Cloud. Some people may be saying, "Oh, is that a competitor to AWS, or what is it?" And we think of Deloitte, of course, as this huge worldwide, one of the big four or whatever it is. But talk to us about Deloitte Cloud a little bit, Akash, and maybe what your role is. Sure,
happy to. So, Alan, as part of Deloitte Cloud, we have actually created a practice called Cloud Engineering, which is part of our consulting team. And as you can imagine, we are as big of a consulting practice as we are an accounting firm. So we're a fairly sizable practice within the umbrella of Deloitte. And within that, cloud engineering has now started representing a significant portion of our consulting business. I personally lead the cloud strategy business here within the US, which essentially means any clients that are looking to start their cloud journey, sometimes restart their cloud journey because they got stalled, look at the financial and business benefits of cloud, and thinking about how cloud can really change the way they operate their day-to-day business. So that's kind of my role in the group that I lead.
What a great role. You must be, you're probably talking to dozens and dozens of organizations. And I know many analysts that would love that catbird seed into, what multiple organizations doing, because look, so many of our audience out here, they're worried only about one organization, right, and what they're doing in cloud. But to be able to look across a horizon of dozens or multiple, it really gives you a much broader view of what's going on. So Akash, we were talking a little bit off camera, and we both kind of agreed that if there's a silver lining, like there can be a silver lining when 180,000 Americans are dead, is that how much worse off would we be without the cloud, without the internet, without, these applications and services that have allowed us to operate, to survive, in some cases even to thrive, during these unsettling times. And this has got to be, as I mentioned to you, someone said to me, we've had 6 years of cloud transformation in 6 months. I'm wondering what your view is from where you sit.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. In fact, we were doing a survey with the hundreds of organizations we support, and the question was, what has really helped you drive and accelerate your digital transformation? You could list out all the executive ranks on the side, and then one option was COVID. And guess what? COVID actually, hands down, was the number one reason that actually drove the digital transformation, because it's the way your employees, your customers, your partners, everybody interacts with you. We just had all of that get changed on us since March of this year, especially here in the US, right? And what we have also started realizing is that it changed, from the standpoint of a lot of technology adoption. But we are in we're in an economy where it's hard to predict your revenues. It's hard to say where is it going to go up, is it going to go down, how's it going to go look next month. I mean, a lot of CEOs and CIOs we're talking to cannot even predict that. And if in that economy you are creating, you have an IT environment that has a huge amount of fixed cost, a huge amount of sticky cost, you can't survive that with that level of cyclical behavior and revenue. And hence, cloud is a savior in that sense, because you really can move towards a consumption-based and a direct linkage to your revenue cycles, and actually can get into a lot more of non-sticky IT costs by leveraging cloud.
No doubt about it. I think one of the things, and I think to a certain extent, as time has gone on, maybe this perception has changed. But I think early on, when you spoke to a lot of executives about their cloud transformation, it was, oh yes, we have to do it right now because everyone's working from home, and we have to transition to that. We've got to get rid of sort of, server closet type or our own data center type applications, or we don't want to get rid of them, but we need to hybridize them more with more of them available over the network and via the cloud. But there was always a but, right? And the but was, maybe by September, by August, by Memorial Day, July 4th, Labor Day, pick your holiday, right? We're going to go back. Like as if somehow, you're going to do some sort of technology cha-cha, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But that's not the way, I've been in technology 30 years. That's not the way technology goes. It never goes back. It does. It's like time. You know how they say time can only go forward. You can't go backward. I think it's the same thing with technology. I'm interested. What are you seeing in there?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the way we've been thinking about this, and this isn't different from a lot of other crises from the standpoint of how organizations have reacted to it. So if you actually put it under perspective, in any kind of crisis, typically you will see people first respond. Meaning, let's just get back on our feet. Let's just make sure we have connectivity back. We have people who can remotely connect and do their day-to-day jobs, right? Then you get into a bit of the recovery mode to say, all right, if unfortunately this becomes the norm, how will I make sure that I can sustain this? And what we have seen is in the last 4 to 5 months, our economy and our country has been so resilient around this that everybody has picked themselves up and driven that back. I mean, the market realities right now, as you can see, the markets are up. So that's definitely happened. What we are now starting to see is the thrive side of it, to say, how can we leverage some of this acceleration in our digital transformation to change the way we will interact with our customers, to change the way we will deliver our products and services. And what you started seeing is a predominant, I would say, 3 things. One, cost reduction is still going to be a predominant priority for CIOs and CEOs because of the revenue cycles, right? They want to be very mindful of where they're spending their money. So while in certain parts, they will look to drive cost reductions, what they are also trying to do is take it in a very deliberate way to take that reduction funds and put it to use on the digital transformations, whether it is providing customers different ways of interacting with your company, providing online channels, mobile channels, and all of that, obviously all enabled by cloud. And we've seen a lot of contact center uptick where a lot of calls are going in saying, I need my laptops or my IT is not working. And how would you create that kind of a help desk self-service environment for your customers? So a lot of that thing is happening. And all this happening in the situation where you don't have funds to do transformations. So what we are starting to see is we, Deloitte, as a systems integrator, coupled with the hyperscaler cloud providers, are coming up with self-funded transformation type areas where we can tell the client, instead of you creating that big bubble of transformation cost, which you can't afford right now, we will help you using some of the incentives and funds available to you and invest in your future. Obviously, trying to make sure that they can get those savings in the longer term. And we, as they get their savings, we can get an outcome-based share of that to basically fund our investments in the upfront years. So that's what we're starting to see, that, a lot of cost reduction focus, a lot of selective growth capabilities focus, but doing those two in the context of self-funding.
Yeah. So a friend of mine is Emmett Keefe. He's a general partner at Insight Partners, a large private equity firm. But he also runs something called Insight Ignite, which is, well, in the pre-COVID was a almost monthly get-together of C-level execs, large enterprises that would look at things like digital transformation. And, Emmett presented at one of our events back in June, and it was based upon his informal survey, if you will, of talking to his network. Budgets were cut overall because of the uncertainty, but it wasn't so much that they were cut as they were reallocated. And I think that's what you're getting at too, right? If you had digital cloud transformation projects, they were accelerated, right? Maybe they were scheduled for Q1, Q2 next year, or, but we need them now. So that they went to the front of the line. Maybe large like ERP projects or something like that, maybe they were pushed back or delayed. They weren't necessarily canceled, but they were pushed into Q2 and Q3 of next year. And because I think it's, industry adapting and recognizing to what we have. But, Akash, back to my point about, we don't go backwards in time. The investments that we're seeing made, the cloud transformations that we're seeing being made and going forward, they're going to be the foundation for tomorrow's growth, for not just getting through this work from home thing and the initial sort of problem we had, but where do we go from here? How do we build on that now? Now, it's like investing in infrastructure, right? We talk about it here in the U.S. We should invest $2 trillion in infrastructure, not just on our roads and bridges, but on our internet and so many other things. Why? Because when you have that infrastructure, you can go faster, you can do more, you can build on it. And to a certain extent, we're doing that right now with our cloud infrastructures, right? Company by company, division by division, with that in place, with this in place that we're putting in, wow, maybe next year, January, this COVID thing is a little bit in the rear view mirror. And where do you think the acceleration comes then?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. So certainly setting the cloud foundation, starting to put your applications on it is happening a lot, right? What we are starting to see is right now, it's a lot more, if I take the business capability lens to it, right? It's a lot more on your systems of engagement side of things. So things that are helping you stay engaged with your customers, with your partners, with your employees. What we see happening is that once that foundation is set and you've got the systems of engagement all starting to run in that agile way on cloud, the next layer is going to be a lot more on your systems of record. That's going to happen because, as you and I can imagine, those are the bloodlines of the firms, right? So they really need to then look into the core systems and see, how can I transform that? How can I make it into much more modern architectures and go towards that? So first, the wave has been a lot more on the engagement side, but we expect that next year that wave is going to start becoming more on the core systems and a lot of that attributes of it.
Absolutely. Akash, I told you the time goes really quick, but we still have a little more. You said something in the beginning that a lot of the organizations you're engaged with are maybe just starting their cloud transformation, or they're looking to fix a broken or an unsuccessful or take another bite at the apple. And this is something even pre-COVID, right? We saw this in surveys, right? That a lot of cloud transformations, a lot of DevOps transformations were not as successful as maybe initial goals, had hoped for. And I'm interested to hear from you in that subset of companies. Why is this helping? Is this this revolution, if you will, or big evolution towards cloud now? Is it helping those companies that maybe weren't successful or as successful before?
Yeah, so let me first explain, from our experience, why were those companies struggling or facing that, and then I'll help address this part of your question. So there were two predominant reasons. So reason number one was it was undertaken as a technology transformation and not an enterprise transformation, right? So what that means is you're fixing the technology, but the operating model, the people, the processes side of it was not. So what we were seeing was data center policies applied to cloud. I mean, you're using cloud as an extension of your infrastructure, not as an extension of your business transformation. And that's where we started seeing a lot of stall happening, because at some point in time, business started asking the question, well, are you changing just the plumbing for me? Or are you actually delivering something more than that, right? So that was number one issue. Number two was, while these things were happening, cloud is basically on-demand technology delivered to you. If you're using an on-demand technology and you don't control and governance around the quantity you use, you may not hit the financial case for actually making this real for you, right? And we were seeing a lot of CFOs, not CIOs, start to question that piece of it, saying, am I getting the financial benefits and the ROI of investments I was putting in? So those were the two predominant reasons, and that's where we have helped a lot of companies, what I would call restart or move away from their stalled cloud journeys to back on track, right?
Yep.
What COVID has now done is that, as I said, the sticky cost of infrastructure, the sticky cost of IT is the number one reason. And with those two issues that I just mentioned acknowledged, and now looking into how can I make my IT go in a consumption-based manner, and I can, in a crawl, walk, run fashion, prove the value to the business in that. That's what we're starting to see a lot of organizations in the post-COVID world start to undertake. And especially in those situations, we have seen a bit of, well, let me maybe slow down my current set of migrations and adoption of cloud to get my foundation right. And then I can start at a much faster clip and a much faster throughput and capacity to go at cloud. So that's what we are starting to see now.
Excellent. And that's one of the best definitions or reasoning as to why some companies did not recognize the success in their cloud and DevOps kind of transformations, and quite frankly, nothing to do with COVID, right? Even historically. So Akash, look, there are people sitting out here who say, yeah, this is all great, but sooner or later, the repercussions of this economy, right? The market's doing great. Wall Street's doing great. The S&P, quite frankly, even the S&P, right? If you take it apart, there are 6 companies that are driving the S&P. All 6 happen to be large unicorn technology companies. And the rest of the S&P is probably down, right? So, there are people out here saying it's not all roses. It's not all hearts and flowers. And sooner or later, if consumer spending is down, if people don't have money, it's going to affect us, right? And we need to save up for that rainy day. We need to get ready for it. We need, right? And this is, like as you said earlier, this happens in all crises. There are some organizations that lean in, some organizations lean out, right? And half glass, half full. I'm asking you now officially, Akash, is Akash Dayal of Deloitte Cloud. What's your advice to these people who are worried and are saying, we got to, maybe we should slow up and save for that rainy day? Bad times are coming.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And, something I wish I had a crystal ball to answer that, right? But I don't. But what I do know is that, companies coming out of this situation, companies that will be leapfrogging their competition, companies that will be successful and go from the good to the great, right? certainly are the companies that are, leaning in and saying, let's use every opportunity we have right now to transform ourselves for our customers, for our environment, for our communities, and get to the right place in the future, right? I mean, as Deloitte, we are certainly supportive of that, and we are doing it ourselves to us as well as for our clients. So have we seen, from a cloud standpoint, any slowdown? Have we seen, companies stall their cloud journeys? Absolutely not. We're actually seeing the inverse of that. We're, if I, close my eyes and say, are we in a crisis situation right now, especially from a cloud standpoint? The answer is no. Companies are really embracing. I mean, at least I'm seeing a lot of positivity around this. Companies are really embracing and driving towards this digital transformation. So I'm very hopeful. But again, that's, what we are seeing, and, nobody has a crystal ball of what's going to happen.
No. So, but I have to tell you that, my technology experience is almost 30 years now. I'm in the industry. And I started my first company, 95, in that range, my first tech company. And sold it, went through the whole .com thing, and saw that rise up. And I saw the company that I sold it to, I stayed on with. We IPO'd, eventually went into bankruptcy, right, when the .com bubble burst. Started my next company in October of 2001, right after 9/11. Tremendous turmoil, choppiness, uncertainty. I left that in 2008 or 9, right, in the midst of the Great Recession. Kind of took stock of where everything was, and in 4 years later, I started what became Media Ops, or what is Media Ops. So I'm a big believer that in uncertain times like this is when the next generation of success is born. Right? I think it's almost easier it's like a new growth forest. When some of those old trees get taken out and the sun can come down, it's great. It's easier to grow. We're almost out of time, but I have one more kind of topic I want to, and it's a different one than what we've spoken about. There are people out here watching our show from around the world, and a lot in the U.S., a lot in Europe, Asia, which is pretty much a lot of part of the world. But anyway, they say, you know what? Akash sounds so on point. These guys at Deloitte Cloud, they understand what's going on. I wish we could bring a Deloitte Cloud in to help us with our transformation, but we're not big enough. We're not a Fortune 500 company. That's a big guys kind of game. What's your advice to, let's call them small, medium enterprise out there, right? Is there a place for them to engage with Deloitte and try to, pick your brain a little bit and try to leverage what you guys are seeing and learning and doing?
Absolutely. In fact, we have actually created a whole market offering around mid-market and, smaller firms, and we do support several of them. So, we Deloitte definitely have that offering, and we do that. In fact, we're seeing a lot of smaller firms and mid-market firms a lot more nimble because, they just don't have the sheer size and scale and the diversity of their portfolio to survive a crisis like that. And that's what we're seeing for them. This is the only way to survive, and we're working with them and supporting them.
Excellent. Akash, I know you need to run. You know what? For people who want information on Deloitte Cloud, where should they go?
Well, they can contact me. Deloitte.com is the best place to go, and you can submit a request through that, or personally contact me.
Fantastic. Akash Tayal, Deloitte Cloud, our guest here on TechStrong TV. Thanks for joining us. This is Alan. Thank you. This is Alan Schimmel. We'll be right back with our next guest. I really miss traveling around the world, going to DevOps and security conferences, cloud native conferences, and meeting with my many friends in the industry. One of those is Dan Garfield, who's from CodeFresh. Dan always has great information, relevant facts to bring us, and I usually look forward to meeting with him at conferences. Of course, we can't do that in person, but we do have Dan on today with a new survey from CodeFresh with some interesting adoption numbers, and this is a year to year. I think it's the third year they're doing this, and you can see the progression here of adoption of certain technologies. So let's now go to my interview with Dan Garfield of CodeFresh.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on another segment of TechStrong TV. My guest this segment is Dan Garfield. Dan is with CodeFresh, CI/CD company, and one of the up-and-comers in this space that's really making big difference. Hey, Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Excited to talk about all of the news.
Absolutely, and we will. Dan, our audience is familiar with CodeFresh, but just in case anyone's not, why don't you give them a quick little background, if you don't mind, to start off, just so we kind of set the table.
Sure. CodeFresh is a DevOps automation platform designed specifically for working with Kubernetes and handling use cases like GitOps to deployment in production on AWS, Amazon, on Google Cloud, and of course Azure, and any other cloud or on-prem environment you have.
Excellent. All right. And what I like about CodeFresh is it's usually fresh. I mean, no pun intended, right? But you guys have taken sometimes you need to take a new look to see things differently and see what changes have been brought.
Especially right now, we're living in what I call a post-crisis world where things are very flexible and changing all the time. And it's actually one of the things that we've noticed. We actually did a survey coming up to KubeCon last week that we released, where we were looking at how the current pandemic and all these things were affecting people's approach to DevOps. And what we found is that far from slowing that shift or that transition to DevOps down, it's accelerating it dramatically.
I mean, that jives with what we're hearing and seeing as well. I mean, look, if you were doing an SAP implementation or something kind of old school like that, not related, that maybe push back a little bit, less priority. But anything that is around cloud transformation, digital transformation, including DevOps, deployment, stuff like this is being accelerated. As some say, we've seen 6 years worth of this crunched into 6 months, and so it doesn't really surprise us too much. Dan, just so we have this straight, this was released at KubeCon. It wasn't KubeCon attendee. Well, it's hard this year because KubeCon was virtual anyway, but it wasn't KubeCon attendees necessarily.
It was announced in coordination with the CNCF at KubeCon, which of course is a virtual event, so of course it's public. And some of the results were very interesting. We asked a great number of people, CIOs, CTOs, DevOps people, engineers, about their plans, and we found that because of COVID-19, that over 75% of teams were planning to accelerate their cloud migration, that they had actually already started doing that. And that makes sense because they need more flexibility because they see demand increase and contract more dramatically. And we've seen this with our own customers. We have customers who are some of the largest gaming companies in the world. And of course, they've needed to expand their infrastructure dramatically. So their DevOps teams are growing very, very quickly. At the same time, we have a number of retailers, very large retailers who are our customers, and they've needed to maybe bring some of those operations down a little bit to coordinate with demand. So what people really need and what they're looking for is that flexibility. So it makes sense that 75% of our respondents would be accelerating their migration to cloud because of this.
Yep. So I'm not surprised with the 75% accelerating the transformation to cloud. I'm cautiously optimistic that half of those are using Kubernetes. So if we extrapolate that, Dan, would we think then that half of all cloud deployments these days or something like that are actually on a Kubernetes infrastructure versus, just straight up hypervisor?
Well, that certainly is likely. We asked people what percentage of their projects were going to be using Kubernetes by the end of the year, and about 75% of people said that more than half of their projects would now be using Kubernetes. So the majority of their projects, 75% of people said the majority of their projects are now moving into Kubernetes, and we are seeing that happen both in the cloud and on-prem. But the largest segment is actually not the pure cloud and it's not the pure on-prem. In our survey, the largest segment are people who are doing both. And that represents about 60% of the respondents said that they're shifting to doing both and moving more into the cloud and keeping some on-prem and basically taking this sort of hybrid approach.
So Dan, this has always been something that I'm baffled with, right? To me, kind of Kubernetes is made for the cloud, right? And distributed environments and containers, right? And we've seen this consistently from day one. There are a decent amount of people who run Kubernetes on-prem. They run it on bare metal servers sometimes, or even serverless. Though serverless is more in the cloud. They'll run it on bare metal servers, on-prem. And I don't get it. I mean, what do you guys see there at CodeFresh? I mean, do you really see that many, on-prem deploy, even in a hybrid situation where some's on-prem, some's up there? What's being deployed on-prem and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to kind of go back even a few years, if we look at where people host their code, if you're Apple, are you going to allow someone else to host your code for you in your repositories? Like, what would the insurance premium need to be on your provider in order for them to host your code for you? So there's just a lot of cases like that, and even financial institutions where what they do is, it's a bit like the language wars. If you go back 10, 15 years, every company had their own language. They were like, oh, we're a .NET shop, we're a PHP shop, and Facebook famously was a PHP shop, right? And that's gone away in favor of people using the language that best fits their needs. And we're seeing the same thing happen with infrastructure, where people are saying, actually, there are some things that we feel like are better for on-prem, and maybe they're secure things, or maybe they're hosted services that are only meant for their internal usage, or those kinds of things. And at the same time, there are a bunch of use cases that are much better suited to the cloud. And so people, rather than being sort of infrastructure maximalists and saying, oh, we should always be this or we should always be that, they're just saying, let's just use the best tool for the job. And sometimes that is something on-prem. And at the same time, you brought up, is Kubernetes really that useful on-prem? And in fact, containers are much more useful on-prem because you can get tighter packing of your infrastructure. So where you might have deployed a fleet of machines, maybe you can reduce that by 30 or 40% because your workloads are able to be distributed more evenly and more quickly across that infrastructure. So it actually does reduce costs of the on-prem hosting too.
Interesting. All right. I mean, we'll have this discussion another day, because I would make the argument that there's very little you could do on-prem that's not more secure in the cloud and not more scalable, and that the amount of money cloud providers put in to keeping their systems up, running, and robust dwarfs any amount of money, maybe other than let's say the Fortune 50. Right? If you're a Fortune 50, you got that kind of resources to duplicate it. Beyond that, I don't think you can duplicate it. But we'll discuss that another day. Let's jump in on the survey. What else do we have here?
So one of the things that did improve a little bit over last year is, one of the questions we ask is, what percentage of your processes are fully automated from the time you make a Git commit to the moment it's deployed? And we did see some improvement on that, about a 10% bump in the amount of automation that's happening. but still less than 4% of people have actually automated their entire release pipeline. It's fairly rare for people to do that. Most people are sitting at less than half of the process being fully automated, and a huge chunk sitting around 19, 20%, less than 10% of the process is automated. And if you think about where you're spending your time and where you're spending your money as a company, if your engineering team isn't effective, if they can't spend most of their time just focused on writing new features, you're going to be less effective as an organization, and you're wasting a lot of money on engineering time. And that lack of automation is sort of linked with how much time engineering is spending fixing bugs. And this is shocking, but we actually had a number of people who said that they spend 100% of their time fixing bugs. They don't ever deliver new features. And at the same time, there's a big chunk that's the 25% to 70% of their time being spent fixing bugs. And so that's just, a lot of that is tied to not having great release and automation processes up front to prevent those bugs from even making it into production.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess the 4% number is shockingly low, right? But
Yeah.
But it, a lot of people, I think, look at that kind of question, and we do a bunch of surveys here, Dan, so I know a little bit about, they look at that kind of question and say, is every single thing automated? Is it end-to-end automated? Well, no, because bug fixing is not automated, or there's something not automated. And this is why sometimes with surveys, you want to just, hey, can we call you on the phone and talk about it a little bit? How much is automated? If it's not end-to-end, what percentage is automated? What is automated? What's not automated, right? And really kind of dig in there. So are we on the threshold of seeing that 4% jump to 20%? Right? There's just one or two things that are holding people back from being totally automated. The other thing is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we also saw that only 18% of people had automated more than 80% of the process. So that would be the prime set that could reach the full automation.
Right.
But it's not, there are technology barriers here. Obviously, I think people should be using a DevOps automation tool that's going to be more reliable and is going to help them automate the entire process. But a lot of that comes down to confidence. If you don't feel like your systems are reliable and robust, you're going to start defaulting more to manual processes where you feel like you're going to be better at it than your automation could be. And what we found, I mean, just look at the last year and a half, a lot of outages are caused by people doing misconfiguration changes manually. Cloudflare had a huge outage, took down most of the internet just a month or two ago, and that was because of a manual change that was being made to their networking tables that didn't go through an automated process of release and delivery. Same thing happened with Amazon last year, and we've seen it over and over and over again. Doing things manually leads to downtime, and people have to accept that that's the reality. And it's a bit like, getting confidence in a self-driving car. You always feel like as the person, as the human, you're going to do it better. But the truth is that machines are better at following checklists than people are. And so if you make a great checklist, you make great automation, you're going to have less downtime, you're going to be more productive, and you're going to spend less time worrying about those releases because you can do them more often. And as the mantra goes, if you want to get good at something, do it more often. So releasing more often and using automation to do it is definitely the future. And it's tied with high productivity, it's tied with high engineering satisfaction, and it's tied with innovation.
Yep. I mean, I think that's one of the central, over the course of 7 years of doing DevOps.com, it's one of the central tenets of DevOps that I don't think people initially get, which is the almost counterintuitive relationship between automation and quality. And security can be tied into that quality as well, right? The more you automate, the faster you go, the more quality and security you get.
Yeah, and this is the whole drive between the GitOps movement, which of course is sort of a subset of DevOps, but the idea that every change gets checked in to code and that code then goes through an automated process of testing, release, and delivery. That means that when you do a retrospective and you say, oh, you know what? We could have caught this if we would have added this test, or we could have caught this if we had maybe done some automated security probing here. You can just add that into your process and it instantly becomes available for everybody on the engineering team. So rather than trying to build your human networks to understand and remember all of those things, you build your automation networks and your policy engines to enforce those things. And you don't have to rely on people always remembering to do it, because it's just going to happen. I remember just a side note, when I was a kid, I went and took a tour of a local airport, and they had this airplane was coming in to land, and the air traffic controller said, oh, we call these doctor killers. I said, why do you call these things a doctor killer? And he said, because doctors are so smart that they don't think that they have to follow checklists. So they don't bother to lower the landing gear, and so they crash the plane when they try to land it because they don't have any landing gear. Checklists make us work properly, and automation is the best way to do it.
Absolutely. Great story, too. You know, I agree. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I agree 100%. Let me ask you another question, though. Do you think there are some organizations, not because of tools, but because of culture? So, you know what? We don't want to fully automate our deployments, right? We, for whatever reason, culturally, just, you know, that's not who we are, what we do, and how we do things here. And you know, those people, all the tools in the world aren't going to help them, right? I think it's more of as I say, a cultural issue. They need to kind of get with, otherwise you get left behind. So
yeah, no.
Anyway,
the cultural issue is not to be understated, and what we find is the pattern, and this is what happens with our customers. Oftentimes, what will happen is we'll have somebody come to us who's from a small team who wants to work on something new, and they've kind of got a lot of energy and they're excited to do things the right way, and they come and they pick up CodeFresh and they build a whole great release process. And then what happens is within that organization, invariably, people are looking around and they say, this team seems super productive. How are they doing that? Why are they so successful? How do we do what they're doing? And then we see it spread through the organization rapidly. And so the key isn't to go and convince a whole organization, hey, you should be doing GitOps, you should be doing DevOps because this is going to make you more productive. Instead, it's this team is getting all the credit. This team is doing fantastic. This team is delivering on time and quality code, and this is how they do it. You can emulate that, or you can wait to be replaced, because that's in the end what's going to happen. If you see those teams moving and they're all getting more effective, you're going to want to join in and be part of that transformation. But if the top-down, you know, CIO comes in and just says, hey, everybody, we got to be 100% automated all the time, that's going to be a little bit harder of a change. Now, definitely we want the support from the CIO and the CTO as part of the equation. But we find that it's often, you know, one or two teams that make a big change. People see that and react within the organization and understand the success and the energy, and then they want to emulate that, and then the practice spreads far and wide. Excellent.
Dan, we're running out of time. I know you have other stuff in the survey here, highlights. What else can we highlight?
So obviously the shift to Kubernetes momentum is massive, and it's been confirmed in a number of surveys. The fact that over 75% of people are going to be using Kubernetes for the majority of their projects is a huge transition from just a couple years ago, where it was maybe 5% of projects, maybe 10% of projects. Wow. So Kubernetes definitely is becoming the standard and the de facto platform for deploying infrastructure. And so we think that by in the next 2 years, you're going to see that increase even more, so that people are doing most of their projects, 80% plus of their projects on Kubernetes. And it just makes sense. It's a great platform. It makes doing GitOps and infrastructure as code much, much easier. And that's something that people often misunderstand. When you ask people why they're using Kubernetes, it's not scalability, it's not reliability, and those things which are really strong for Kubernetes as a platform. It's always developer productivity. we think that if we have this wonderful way of creating all of our applications as code, our infrastructure as code, and we can do GitOps, it's going to make our engineers more effective. That's why we're adopting Kubernetes. So all of this goes hand in hand. Kubernetes adoption going up makes DevOps adoption go up, makes GitOps adoption go up, makes people deploy more often and have fewer bugs. It's all about that level of automation and nearing to 100%. And so that's where the biggest shift that we expect in the next 2 years is going to happen, is going to be in increasing the amount of automated processes and policies that people use to make their engineering teams fly.
Great stuff, man. Dan, we got to wrap up, but for people who want to jump in and get more information on this survey, where can they go?
Go to codefresh.io and just check out our blog there, where we have the top post right now is the survey. And feel free to check us out on Twitter at codefresh. And of course, we post results and excerpts from the survey and other things there.
Excellent. Dan, it's great to see you. I'm sorry we don't see each other in person anymore. Hopefully one day, soon.
One day.
We'll get there. But in the meantime, keep up the great work. Say hello to everyone at CodeFresh. Great stuff in this survey.
Thanks, Alan. Really appreciate it. Will do.
All right. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps, for TechStrong TV and DevOps.com with Dan Garfield from CodeFresh. Thanks. We'll be back with our next guest. So one of the hot areas in application security has been something that I think it was Forrester deemed software composition analysis, or SCA. Checkmarx has been a leader in AppSec now for probably 7-8 years, and I think at one point they had OEMs, someone else's SCA, then developed their own in-house SCA tool, which has gotten better and better and is now one of the leaders. We speak to Susan St. Clair from Checkmarx about SCA and how in these times it's becoming increasingly important and critical, in fact, to make sure that your open source software is both compliant from a license point of view, safe from vulnerabilities, latest editions, etc. So here's my interview with Susan St. Clair from Checkmarx.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey everyone, it's Alan Schimmel, and thanks for joining us on another segment of TechStrong TV. My guest for this segment is Susan St. Clair of Checkmarx. Susan, welcome back to TechStrong TV. Nice to have you here.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Okay, Susan, we're going to launch, into our topic for today. But before we do, I'm sure most of the people in our audience are familiar with Checkmarx, but there might be some who aren't, right? Maybe you've never heard of Checkmarx before. That's CheckMarx, Checkmarx. But why don't, Susan, give them a quick primer background on Checkmarx.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Happy to do so. So Checkmarx is a application software security software provider. We focus on providing AST solutions for pre-production primarily, so static, IAST, SCA, open source, and fitting that into development and DevOps tool chains.
Yep. It was dynamic scanning too, correct?
Right, with the IAST. You're right. Yep. Just
want to make sure we don't leave anything out. And Checkmarx has actually been at this longer than most. I mean, I remember first being involved with Checkmarx. It was our first DevSecOps at RSA, and it had to be 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. And,
no numbers there.
Okay. All right.
But you're right. We have been in the game for quite some time, starting with static, and then slowly kind of expanding our portfolio with, again, some of the new and up and coming things that application teams are struggling with, the dynamic, the open source, and I did forget our e-learning, so security focused e-learning platform as well.
Very cool. So, Susan, one of the areas that Checkmarx has really made a big push in, and you're one of the primary leaders there on this, is in the area of open source security, open source security scanning. And when we say open source security scanning, we mean scanning of open source code within applications. And today's applications have lots of open source code in them. So it's well worthwhile. And some analyst firms have given this the name SCA, software composition analysis. But really what we're talking about is open source scanning. Of course, we're sitting here in COVID. Well, no, we don't have COVID, thank God. But we're sitting here in this environment where COVID has so drastically changed the way we're building our software, where we build them from, what tools do we use, how fast do we need them built. How has this, have you guys seen it, how has this played out in regard to open source, in regard to open source security?
Sure. Yeah, and I think just like we were talking before we started recording, again, the pressure is really on to do more faster, right? So, you were saying that, you're seeing, and we've seen it too, where CI/CD, DevOps, automation is really a big push for organizations. And how that relates to open source is that, again, as you mentioned just a second ago, we see more and more open source being used in applications, both as a way to, again, why recreate the wheel? Let me just use something that's already been created. So as a way to kind of jumpstart or deliver faster. But we're also seeing now that because open source comprises such a large amount of applications that we're developing and that we are producing, we now need to make sure from a security point of view that those are secure too. So fitting that into the automation tool chains, so being able to, put it into CI/CD and scanning those for security in an automated way, but also even taking a look at, maybe working with the SCM, so the source code managers like the GitHubs and the GitLabs and all of those out there, and having webhooks and triggers around pull requests. So really automating the whole process so that developers get the information they need when they need it versus having it, at some point in the future and then they're like, yeah, we've moved on.
Right. Well, but so that's important. Timing is everything, right? And whether we're talking about getting your results of COVID tests or the results of open source security scanning, I think it's important, and there's a lesson for security people that was hard for us to learn, that justice delayed is justice denied. Security delayed is security denied. Developers are not going to stand around not doing nothing or not deploying software because it's taking you time to sign off on it, right? If you can't get your tests done in time and show what needs to be fixed or not, the train leaves the station and they deploy, and then you got to deal with it after the fact where it's 10 times or 100 times more expensive and costly to fix these things. So, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of doing this timely, and especially when you talk about automation, right? Because automation takes place like this. So you can't have a whole automated process and then a manual software security test, open source security test.
It doesn't work well with that. It doesn't work well. And you're right. I think this has been an adjustment. And I think one of the things that COVID is doing is that, we in the industry, we've been talking about this forever and a day, right? You know, making it a part of a normal delivery, automation, whatever process. But COVID has really pushed us to do that. And again, I think at this point, integrating into CI/CD in a smart way, hopefully we've all moved to that as a need, but now even shifting further left, so working again with those source control repos and being able to automate on developer-driven events, again, the commits, the pushes, and actually putting results into those places for developers to look at versus within a security tool, within, you know, some other thing that isn't part of their ecosystem. So that, I think, has been a big change in terms of, again, really kind of getting into that ecosystem and working with the webhooks and the apps into those and all of that good stuff. That I think has been a fundamental change, and I think COVID is driving that. Not that it didn't happen before, but it's again, it's accelerating that push.
Yeah, no, necessity's the mother of invention, right? And
Yeah.
so when you have to get it done, you got to get it done like this. Susan, now, so developers are doing that. Checkmarx clearly sees this in market. What are you guys doing? I mean, has it accelerated Checkmarx's own development of their open source security tools? Right? Because it's kind of like a chain reaction.
Sure. I think it has. Again, you know, Checkmarx has always had a solution for this. I shouldn't always, but has had a solution for this for a bit. But we really launched this new SCA solution this year as a way to really address those needs. So that with the addition of kind of our orchestration platform with CXFlow, which I think you have done other podcasts on, you know, I think this has really kind of pushed Checkmarx from a product point of view to really support those initiatives and really support those workflows. And then of course us internally, right? And again, we are a software company, so a lot of the challenges that our customers go through, we go through internally as well. So being able to kind of validate and say, yes, I can see this is a problem and we need a better solution, I think that's a good synergy between the two. So I guess, you know, products being more focused on those work streams come from internal as well as external sources, so that drives.
Absolutely. One of the things that I always think about around these subjects, though, Susan, is, right, and I think we're getting there, we transition to this new normal environment, right? Let's call it post-COVID environment. Not that COVID's passed and we don't have to worry about it, but this is the new normal. This is the way we work going forward. This is the way we're used to working. 60% of us don't go back to the office. You know, so all of these things flow from it. What sticks, right? Do we start saying, hey, man, you know what? We had to use a lot of this open source because we had to get this stuff out, but we really need to rethink this now. And you know, do we change the mix a little bit, or you know, this is the way it is now. We just go forward with it. I know things won't stay the same because that's not how life is, right? We're constantly changing. What do you think?
That's a tough question. I tend to think that when things change and they're successful, they stick. So we're seeing like the acceleration with digital transformation. We're seeing more automation. We're seeing this push where developers take more ownership, if you will, of open source security. So I think that will stay. Where I think maybe the caveat is where maybe it shifts a little bit more towards custom development versus using open source is maybe, you know, again, if we don't take security seriously and then we see a lot of consequences to using it, right, from a business point of view. So then that kind of drives back and people pull back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't use that latest Apache, open source component that, maybe we should own that ourselves. But I don't think it's going to switch all the way back. I do think that this is a trend that's here to stay.
Agreed. Susan, I was talking with a friend of mine. It's one of our writers here at Media Ops, and he's been covering the security scene for 25 years. And we got into a tiff because, I told him that today's applications are so heavily dependent on open source, and even the code within the application is majority open source. And that set him off on a frantic Google search for metrics, right? And he came back to me, this is all over Messenger, not in person or anything. Came back to me, so I found the numbers. That's only true for internal applications, right? So in other words, applications that are developed for our internal use in the organization, we tend to want to put those together quick, down and dirty, and we cobble together a lot of open source stuff, and that's how we get this application out. But that kind of public-facing applications, commercial software, whatever you want to call it, is not predominantly open source. What do you think?
I think this would be an amazing conversation to have, but I think it does vary by industry. So you will see certain industries that are more open to open source or not, right? Like I'm thinking more manufacturing, just because of the technologies they use, perhaps not so open source heavy. I don't know that as a general rule that it's internal versus external. I think that if you went to some of these external commercial facing applications and you asked them for their inventory list, you would be surprised in terms of the open source components that they're using. Because it's not something I think as a vendor that you just naturally disclose. But I can speak from just a Checkmarx point of view. We absolutely use open source components in our technology, and we sell it. So
that's the way it's always been, though. I mean, look, when I co-founded Still Secure, and we did intrusion prevention and vulnerability management and then network access control, everyone was using the Snort engine for IDS, IPS, right? Marty Roche and the SourceFire guys, Nessus and the forks of Nessus as a vulnerability scanner, still being used today in some places. There was Clam AV, was the open source AV. So many companies had this kind of stuff. Nmap, another scanner under the hood, right? They were under the hood, packaged in with a commercial interface and stuff, and off you went. And that was security. I mean, I think it's the same across the board, but like you said, that is a great topic for another discussion at some point. Maybe we can
that would be more fun over in person versus over Messenger, but still fun.
Absolutely. Susan, we're almost out of time. What else can you anything else you want to share with the audience?
No, other actually just kind of as a follow-up to that last one, I think, if this is a concern, and I think it should be a concern across the board, I think it's always worth asking your vendors, what open source do you use? Can you give me a bill of materials, versions, licensing, all that? And then what kind of security tests did you do to make sure that those are good? I mean, we assume that we do good vetting when we purchase software, but it's a good question to ask so you understand the risk that you might be exposing yourself to.
Excellent. We didn't mention, Susan, for people who want more information on open source and Checkmarx products, where can they go?
Sure. The best place, as you mentioned earlier in the show, is checkmarks.com. So checkmarks with an X.com. And then for open source specific, again, you can go to the products or the solution page and look, or just even go into the search and do SCA, search for SCA.
Software composition analysis.
Exactly.
Yep. Susan St. Clair, Checkmarks, thanks for joining us on TechStrong TV. It's been always a pleasure to have you on. Come back and visit us soon.
Please invite me anytime.
Okay, you have an invite. Hey, this is Alan Schimmel, TechStrong TV. We're going to be right back with our next guest.
CISO Talk, to hear how real-world CISOs are dealing with today's real-world issues. From enabling secure remote workers to accelerating secure cloud adoption, defending against a pandemic of security attacks and beyond. CISO Talk covers the cyber topics you want to learn about. With your hosts, Unisys CISO Matt Newfield and MediaOps CEO Alan Schimmel, featuring a revolving panel of CISO cyber experts. This is where CISOs talk. Join us on digitalanarchist.com and techstrong.tv.
For our Something Old today, we're going again to TechStrong Con and replaying what was one of my favorite presentations at TechStrong Con, and that's from the one and only Cornelia Davis. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Cornelia a number of times over the years. She's really bright and just really a real leader in this community. Cornelia's presentation at TechStrong Con was on GitOps and why it's important and what you need to know. And it's as relevant now as it was 2 or 3 months ago as GitOps continues to grow in importance. So from TechStrong Con back in June, here's Cornelia Davis on GitOps.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the TechStrong Con. It is so great that in spite of these times where we are all sequestered at home, that we have the opportunity to get together this way and share ideas and collaborate in spite of the challenges that we're faced with. And thank you so much for the TechStrong team for making this possible. I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to chatting with many of you in the Slack channel behind the scenes. So what I want to talk about today is GitOps. Yes, if you have your buzzword bingo card out, you can go ahead and fill in that square, because GitOps has definitely become a term that is buzzword bingo worthy. But what I want to do today is I want to really talk about what it is, and more importantly than that, what is the value that it can bring, the business value that it can bring to an organization. So let me set the stage to start. In setting that stage, I'm going to start with this basic in IT stack diagram. As we all know, that it used to be the case that when we were going to bring a new application online, we had to start many, many months in advance, and we had to procure hardware, and then we had to rack and stack that hardware and layer everything up on top of it, and there weren't necessarily clean boundaries between those layers. And then, of course, virtualization came along, and we were able to abstract away one layer of that. That's kind of the gray box on the bottom. And then increasingly, we started to build platforms on top of that. And yes, the Kubernetes logo there is intentional. These days, really, to a large extent, the platform of choice for a great number of people is Kubernetes. And then this allows us then to again, have an abstraction and a layer of separation between the application and everything that needs to be done to build and run that application in production. We have now these layers of abstraction. Now, if we assume that kind of basic structure with these basic layers of abstraction, let's think about the developer and operations lifecycle for software. So we have a developer, and that developer is cutting source code and checking it into a source code repository. Very, very mature already is CI technology, and that CI technology is going to run some pipelines that automatically on Git check-in or some source code check-in are going to run some tests, maybe some unit tests, maybe some level of integration tests. And these days it's going to generate an artifact. And again, these days that artifact is increasingly some type of a container image, a Docker image, OCI image, something like that. Where we start talking about GitOps is that not only are we going to use something like Git or a source code control system to store the application code that we then build into an artifact, we are also going to increasingly store the application configuration in a Git repository or something like that. Now that we have our application configuration and the application artifacts that are the things that we're going to deploy, we can use some kind of a GitOps-driven continuous delivery process to deliver that application into our runtime environment. Now, there's an awful lot of white space left on this slide, so let's go ahead and fill that in. As it happens, this process that I'm talking about lives over on the platform side as well, so lives beneath that application layer, application abstraction. So when it comes to managing the platform, and it's become very, very common for us to talk about managing platform as a product, just like we manage applications as a product. If we're managing application or platform as a product, we have a platform engineer. Now, if that platform that they're managing is Kubernetes, we also have developers of Kubernetes. So we've got Kubernetes contributors that are checking code into a source code repository. There's a release process, there's a CI and release process that goes through, does the testing, integration testing, generates the artifacts. Those artifacts themselves make up a Kubernetes cluster. So we've got a whole bunch of images that make up the Kubernetes capability. Now, when it comes to making Kubernetes available in your organization, your platform engineer is going to make the decisions around the configuration of Kubernetes, and they're going to store that configuration in a Git repository. Now, what we're going to do is a GitOps-driven continuous delivery process to deliver that actually into the infrastructure so that the platform gets established. But it goes beyond that as well. It's not only the core Kubernetes, because core Kubernetes doesn't really have enough to support the application tier above. We need all sorts of other components. And those components are being built by a component developer. So those are components like Prometheus, Grafana, Flux, Weave Cloud, WeaveNet, some of the products that my company works on. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Now, that component developer, of course, is following that fairly traditional CI and release process, checking their source code into Git repository. And of course, because we're targeting Kubernetes here, that release process generates, a whole bunch of OCI images that have things like Prometheus, Grafana, and those types of things in it. Now, the platform engineer, again, is responsible for ultimately deploying those things. So they store that component configuration in a Git repository, and then they you guessed it, use a GitOps-driven CD process to deploy that into the platform. What I'm getting at here is that this platform team experience and this application team experience have very common patterns. And so the first punchline here is that when I'm talking about GitOps, I'm not just talking about GitOps for the application or GitOps for the platform. I'm actually talking about GitOps as a general pattern. Now, one more thing about these personas that's very important is that the application team and platform team, they each, even though the patterns are very similar and they're both going to be using things like GitOps and they're both going to be realizing value from the use of GitOps, they do have slightly different goals, and keeping those goals in mind is also very important. The application team is responsible for moving fast. They're responsible for, with very short feedback loops, iterating on their software, delivering it to their customers, getting feedback, and iterating again. And they want to move as quickly as possible. And in the past, they weren't able to move that quickly, in part because the process of deploying things into production was a rather lengthy process, because you had to address concerns like security, compliance, IT was managing costs and all of those types of things. And today, where we're releasing code several times a day, it's not that those concerns have gone away. Those concerns are still there, but they're being addressed by the platform team increasingly. And so we will start to touch upon those things as we go through the remainder of the conversation. So that was kind of level setting. Let me tell you what we're going to cover in the remaining time of our remaining time together. I am going to take just one very quick slide to tell you who I work for. I work for a company called Weaveworks, and I do want to tell you a little bit about what we do. But that's really very minor, just to give you that context. The bulk of the conversation is going to be around what is GitOps, and it's really the principles, some of the mechanics, and then I want to talk a little bit about what do we GitOps, and there's the punchline, all the things. And then I want to spend the latter half of our conversation really focusing on the business value of GitOps. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about myself so you know who I am. I have been in the industry for about 30 years. I am a trained computer scientist, so both in undergraduate and graduate school as well. And when I entered the workforce, I was a developer. And you'll notice there that says in parentheses, I wasn't ops. Now, there's a little bit of a longer story, but when I first started working on application platforms, maybe about 7 years ago or so, I was working on Cloud Foundry. I was at Pivotal at the time, and I, at the time, believed everything I read about platform as a service, that it was all about the developer, until I went out and I started working with our Pivotal customers. And it wasn't more than a month or two into my new gig that I realized that, in fact, what we were doing was that we were doing development with operations in mind. And that platform as a service was really about streamlining that operations process as well. So while I say I wasn't ops, I definitely consider myself a developer and an operations person. I guess you could call me a DevOps person. I've been working in web architectures for more than 15 years. I've been working in cloud native and in Cloud Foundry for 8 years. We didn't call it cloud native back then. We were talking about platform as a service. We were talking about microservices and those types of things. And it wasn't until some time later that cloud native kind of emerged as a common pattern. And speaking of cloud native, one of the other things that I have done more recently is about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I released a book that I wrote with Manning called Cloud Native Patterns. And Cloud Native Patterns is a book targeted at the application architect and the application developer to help them understand the software architecture patterns that make software run well in the cloud. And the cloud I like to describe as being highly, highly distributed and experiencing constant change. The infrastructure itself is changing all the time, as well as the software itself. Now, as I move into the topic of GitOps, I'll come back to the notion of cloud native because it applies to not just these microservice patterns. And the patterns that I'm talking about are things like retries, circuit breakers, service discovery. Those are all the things that I cover in the book. And by the way, just a short self-serving comment on the side there is you'll notice that there's a discount code of 40% off. If you go to manning.com and you get the book there, you can use this code, the TechStrong code that you see there on the screen, to get 40% off of the book. And I would be so honored if you were interested in that. Okay, without further ado, one more very short commercial, and that is the company that I work for. At the beginning of this year, in January, I started with the company Weaveworks. Weaveworks is the company that, in fact, coined the term GitOps. And there's a great story behind it in that we were running our own Kubernetes-based service as a SaaS service on the cloud. In doing that operations, we were adhering to the patterns that have become GitOps now. We were doing those things ourselves because they were providing us value. And we had a system outage. Our SaaS service went down, and we were able to recover it completely in, a matter of 20 or 30 minutes. And it's because of the patterns that we had employed in creating and operating that SaaS platform. And it was that epiphany, that was in that moment that we said, these patterns could actually be useful for a larger audience. And that was really how this GitOps area was born. We are a mid-stage startup with some good backing, that, as you can see there. We partner with all of the major clouds, And you can see there that we are heavily committed to open source. My colleague and CEO, Alexis Richardson, who is the person who coined the term GitOps, was a founding member of the CNCF as well, and sat on the TOC, the Technical Oversight Committee, for, the first 4 or 5 years of the tenure of the CNCF. We also have lots and lots of projects that are out in the open source, everything from the interface to EKS. As I said, we partner with companies, as well as some key components for the GitOps, things like Flux and what we call the Helm operator, as well as some of the components that you can use to run your workloads and run your clusters particularly well, things like Cortex, which is a scale-out Prometheus service, and so on. So enough said about that. What I want to do now is jump into the main program here. And we're going to start out with, what is GitOps? So one of the definitions, the main definition that we use, is that GitOps is a set of modern best practices for deploying and managing cloud-native infrastructure and applications. And under cloud-native infrastructure, we include cloud-native platforms as well. So this is all about using a set of best practices and some tooling, and we'll talk about that tooling, to support the operations of everything in that stack that I showed you earlier. In short, what GitOps is cloud native operations. So just like when we started building microservices and we needed a set of cloud native patterns to help us manage those microservices, now that everything wasn't in one process, we had to deal with things like service discovery and retries, because we know that the network is flaky. So we know that we need to compensate for that. Similarly, we have to compensate and come up with new patterns for operations. And that's exactly what we've done with GitOps. Now, before I dig more into what GitOps is, I want to start out with what GitOps isn't. Now, this is a picture that we saw earlier, which is the developer and the DevOps engineer. They're using Git to store their source code, kick off their CI process, store their application configuration, which increasingly is, the latter is YAML, and the former, again, gets created into the artifact, which is an OCI image. And if our target runtime is Kubernetes, we might be tempted to just say, well, gosh, the delivery process, that GitOps-driven CD process that I mentioned earlier, can't we just, at the end of our CI process, push this thing into Kubernetes? I mean, after all, I've got my YAML that's stored there, and that YAML is the language of Kubernetes. Can't I just, like I said, in the last step of CI, push this out to a Kubernetes cluster? And the answer is no. So if we start with continuous integration, and I'll explain why the answer is no in just a moment. So continuous integration is something that, frankly, we're not mucking with. So GitOps is not trying to go in and trying to reinvent continuous integration. This is something that's been under development for at least a decade, probably closer to 2 decades. And that's quite mature, and it's working extremely well, so that developers can just stay in their IDE, they can check into their source code repository, tests are automatically run, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is quite mature. And so again, the question is, can't I just do this? Can't I just, after I've checked in something into GitHub, do a deploy, and as a part of, after doing that deploy, do the test, get the feedback into the IDE, and so on? And again, I've already said no. Well, why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons. Number one, in certain environments, regulated environments, for example, there's a strict separation of concerns. Developers, they release artifacts, they do not touch production. Operators, they touch production. And by the way, the operators, they're not doing anything in development, because you need to have that separation of concerns, because we don't want one party to really have the keys to everything, so that they can either inadvertently or deliberately introduce some type of a vulnerability. The next thing is, very much related to that, is that the CI process really shouldn't have keys to production. That's kind of putting the CI process, putting them into kind of God mode, if you will. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. The other thing to notice is that, particularly now where we are operating in the cloud, you typically have many, many deployment environments. So you're not just deploying to one area. Certainly you're deploying to different areas throughout your software delivery lifecycle. So dev, test, staging, production. But even in production, you're generally not deploying to only a single production environment. You're deploying to multiple production environments. Even if it's an active passive, you have things in multiple data centers because you can't tolerate downtime anymore. It's not okay if you have an electrical storm somewhere and it takes out power to one data center, that your customers are going to understand that they can't access their bank balance. They expect that to be up 24/7, regardless of what kind of catastrophe is happening in the world. And then finally, recreating a deployment. Let's say you've had a catastrophe and you need to reestablish a deployment. You shouldn't have to go all the way back to your CI process. Of course, you could build a CI process where you have flags and you say, oh, don't actually rebuild, or you might say, well, nothing's changed in the source code repository, so those things are no ops. But tightly coupling the CI process to the deployment process really can get very, very complex. And so what we're talking about here is we're actually talking about loosely coupling the continuous integration process from the continuous deployment process. And to give you a little bit of a foreshadowing of where we're going to go in just a moment, it's not only the deployment process, but it's also the operational process. So the punchline of all of this is that GitOps is not equal to Git delivery. We've also got the Git operations process at the back end. And I promise that we'll get into the details of that and start to explain it. Now, I mentioned earlier that GitOps wasn't just about a particular technology. I mentioned that there were principles of GitOps. So let's think about those principles. Let me cover those principles here. They really are summed up very well across these 4 different angles. I'm going to start at the bookends of this. On the left-hand side, you see that it says the entire system is described declaratively. What that means is that we do not have imperative scripts. We do not have bash scripts that we have to execute to establish a particular environment. We describe it declaratively, meaning, hey, here's an expression of what I want running. That's it. Now, how do I actually get that running? Well, that's the other end. That's the other bookend of this slide on the far right-hand side. And that is we have software agents that are going to ensure that that make it so, that are going to ensure that what we actually have running out in the systems and the target systems matches what we've described declaratively. Now, this pattern a few years ago, 5 years ago or so, was still pretty new and novel. But this is something that Kubernetes has served, if nothing else, and it's done quite a bit else. It has certainly made the entire industry aware of this eventually consistent model where we describe our desired state and there's some type of tooling that happens on a continuous loop that is constantly making sure that what you've asked for in your desired state is what matches the actual state. So those are 2 very important principles of GitOps. Now, the next one over from the left is that desired state that you've described declaratively is going to be checked into a source code control system. And that might be Git. Now, in this talk, I'm not going to trade off Git versus something else. I have a whole nother talk that I do where I talk about things like the Git semantics and the importance of those. But for now, as we're staying at this relatively high level, let's just talk about it in terms of Git. So the whole thing's versioned in Git. And now what we need is we need an ability to control the delivery of that declared state, that desired state, into the runtime that's actually going to make it so. And that's where that automatic application comes in. That's really where the continuous delivery comes in. Now, these are the 4 principles, and we're going to go through these in more detail in a moment. But I want to show you another version of that slide where I've highlighted some other terms. So originally I had everything highlighted in red. Now I've emphasized some other words. On the left-hand side, it's the entire system. It's not only that you're declaring part of the system, but really you achieve the most efficiencies when you do apply this principle to the entire system. It's not only that you're deploying things into Git, but it's that they need to be versioned. And the particular way that Git does versioning is extremely valuable to GitOps. When I talk about the system here is really talking about two things. It is the system that's running the GitOps process. I like to call that the GitOps runtime. And then there's also the system in which your desired state will be running. In the third column, you can see there that I had highlighted automatically applied, but now I've also additionally highlighted system. By system, I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that there's a system which is going to run the GitOps process. I like to call that the GitOps runtime, and we won't talk about that too much today. But I also want to point out that the system is also referring to the target where your desired state is going to be running. I've been talking about Kubernetes so far, so you might be thinking, yeah, it's applications that are deployed into Kubernetes. But in fact, you can gain a lot of value in applying GitOps practices and these principles to targets other than Kubernetes. So for example, you could use a GitOps process to manage the resources that you're putting into a content delivery network, for example. So that's why I'm highlighting system. And then finally, I've highlighted closed loop at the end there. And notice that the first part of this phrase says that software agents ensure correctness and perform actions on divergence. Those actions could be automatic reconciliation, so bringing things back into alignment, or it could be that in fact there was some type of a process that was evolving what was happening in the runtime system, and we want to capture that because that was valuable. Let's say horizontal pod auto scaling, for those of you who know Kubernetes, like automatic scaling of something, we may want to capture that and bring it all the way back into the source of our declarative configuration. Like, oh, we've had a spike in traffic, so we've doubled our capacity. You might want to capture that back in the Git system at the back end. So we won't go into all of these details, but I wanted to highlight those so that you have an idea of where we're going with GitOps. Now, here's another diagram that we are very fond of using, which is to point out, again, as a summary, what we have is we have the continuous integration process, which is well established. And then we have a continuous delivery and operations practice, GitOps practice, on the right-hand side. Now, I've just expressed all of that in very much an abstract way, very much principles. What I want to do now is get a little bit closer to the mechanics. So let's see what a workflow might look like, a GitOps workflow would look like. So the first thing is I'm going to start out with Git. And in Git, I have a version history of my declared desired state. And that's capturing the entire system. Okay. Now, one of the things that's important about Git here is that at each node in the history, I have the entire state of the system. And that turns out to be extremely valuable. That means that I don't have to rebuild it. I've got the entire state. Now, you'll notice there that I've also depicted a number of different version histories, and that will become important later on when we start to drill into the details. We also have repositories, like in this case, I'm showing Harbor, or it might be Docker Hub, or it might be JFrog's Artifactory, or something along those lines. I have the entire system expressed in repositories. So I don't have a file share somewhere that some operator is pulling from, and they're renaming things and those types of things. And there are some versioning. That's why version history here is on the slide. There are some implications around things that you need to do with versioning. Once we have that entire system, we have a composition and synchronization process. And that is really kind of that delivery part of the continuous operations and continuous delivery and operations. And what that does is it will do some level of composition. It also does things like fills in parameters. So if you're familiar with things like Helm or Customize, it's going to fill in values for a particular environment. And then we have the delivery that is going to happen, that composition and synchronization delivers things into the GitOps runtime. And then in the GitOps runtime, we have these software agents that are maintaining the correct state on the right-hand side. Now you'll notice there that I've now called out specifically that I'm not only targeting Kubernetes as my target runtime, but I also might be targeting virtualized infrastructure like cloud infrastructure or physical infrastructure or content delivery networks or identity systems or et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we remember before that we had this picture when I was setting the stage at the beginning of the hour, well, that part that I referred to as GitOps driven CD is really just this part. But GitOps includes that latter part as well, continuous operations. So what we have is we have this picture where on the left-hand side we have continuous integration, and then on the right-hand side, GitOps is made up of a number of services that help us in delivery, composition, synchronization, those types of things, and then a number of services that help us keep things running. So if we then go back to this picture and we fold those things together, delivery and operations is what we call GitOps. And so here's my definition. GitOps is equal to continuous delivery and continuous operations, or CD plus CO. And by the way, it also places some requirements on continuous integration as well. And those things have to do to a large extent with the versioning semantics that I was hinting at earlier. So for example, to be very pragmatic, when you're putting things into your Docker Hub or your container registry, please do not use the tag latest. Have your tags be write once, because then you can leverage tags to implement that important semantic, which is immutability. But I won't go into that in more detail. So to sum this up, we're getting close to finishing up the first half of our conversation here, is that I want to emphasize again that it's principles. It's not specific technologies. Now, it's true that the logos that you see here on the screen are the ones where GitOps is perhaps most frequently applied today. And that is that you're declaring your desired state in YAML, you're storing it in Git, you're using something like Flux to do that automatic delivery into the GitOps runtime, which is running on Kubernetes, and your applications, your target environment is also Kubernetes. And so this is a very common configuration. But in fact, you might want to start expressing your declarative configurations in a number of different languages. And there's some really interesting work that's been going on out in the industry around that, in using things like TypeScript or Python or any kind of like JavaScript type of language to do that declarative description. And there's some advantages to doing that. There are some ways that you can use languages, these programming languages, to do things like inheritance or to be able to apply parameters across a number of different files. So I mentioned earlier that you might be using Helm or Customize to instantiate parameters for the various runtime environments. Well, there are some ways of doing that in object-oriented languages that really make things very good. And there are some projects out there. For example, Amazon has a project called CDK8s, which is in fact the reason that I pulled out the TypeScript and the Python logos, because those are the two languages that they support in that today. So it gives you a way to you're not allowed to go off and start using imperative processes, but it allows you to declare, if you will, objects. And then those objects, if you remember, we have that YAML compilation process, that instantiation, composition, and delivery process, then that can happen as a part of it. In terms of the repositories that we store things in, of course, we already have image registries. I've already been talking about those. But what about something like an S3 bucket, or even existing enterprise systems that you might have that you're using for some level of configuration control today, something like ServiceNow? So again, we have to be very, very careful there, because the GitOps process works best when it has certain things like immutability and version histories in those repositories, and we may have to tool that up ourselves. But from a principles perspective, we can absolutely integrate into some of the existing IT systems that you have today. In terms of automatic delivery, I'm not going to drill in on that. I'm just going to somewhat self-servingly stick with Flux there because that's the thing that we use the most at Weaveworks. But then again, I also mentioned at the end that we have the various target environments, and I mentioned that on the previous slide as well, that we can be deploying into lots of things. So again, to sum it up, what is GitOps? GitOps is about continuous delivery, continuous operations, and it's about cloud native operations where you do need continuous delivery and continuous operations. All right, with that, I am now going to turn to the latter half of our conversation, which is why? What's the value that I'm going to get out of this anyway? Sounds like cool technology. And yeah, you can probably immediately see that there might be some benefits. For example, it might make things easier for the developer. Certainly, it's with my emphasis on things like version history and things like that, it's pretty easy to see that, gee, if I have the entire version history, maybe it'll be easy for me to go back to what I had before by simply going back one step or 5 steps in my version history and those types of things. And yeah, maybe at a high level, you're thinking, okay, well, that'll maybe allow me to do multiple clouds and things like that. But what I want to do is I want to drill into it in further detail. Now, the mechanism where I want to drill into it in further detail is I'm going to start with some existing work. This is not my work, but this is work that somebody else has already done, and I'll get to that punchline in just a second, that has tied certain IT behaviors and metrics that can be measured that give you an indication of how well those IT practices are being followed, and tying those measurements directly to business outcomes. Many of you are probably guessing already where I'm headed with this, and yes, you would be right. This is the work that DORA has been doing, or the DevOps Research Assessment Organization. If you don't know it by the acronym or by that name, you probably know it by the State of the DevOps report. So DORA is an organization that was created by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim. And they have for a number of years been publishing the State of the DevOps report, which does this. It actually applies scientific methods to correlate certain IT behaviors with business outcomes. What you see on this slide, which is a diagram that was taken out of the 2019 State of the DevOps report, is across the top, you see elite, high, medium, and low performing organizations. Now, those organizations are given that title based on exactly the things that you would expect. The highest performing organizations are the ones that have the greatest market share, that are gaining market share, that are profitable, that have the highest net promoter scores, etc. And the lowest performing organizations are those that are losing market share, that are losing money, that are losing customers, that have unhappy customers even if they're locked in. So that's across the top. And they've studied, again, these IT practices, and they've come up with 4 specific measures that correlate wonderfully with these high to low performing organizations. And we'll go through those very briefly here. Number 1 is deployment frequency. It shows, their research shows, that high performing organizations release code far more frequently than low performing organizations. As you can see, they're releasing on demand or multiple times per day. So deployment frequency is something that you shouldn't just be aiming for because it sounds good. It's actually correlated to business outcomes. The second thing is lead time for changes. This is the old code is complete and it takes me 6 weeks to get it out into production. That's not so good. So lead time for changes says, okay, I have something that's ready to be changed in production. How long does it take me to get that deployed into production? Again, you can see that the high performers are less than once a day. The low performers can take months. The third metric is, so those 2 are really kind of deployment process type of metrics. The other 2 have to do with more around the stability of the system. One is the time to restore a service. So if a service has experienced some kind of a problem, how long does it take you to restore that from some kind of a problem? And then finally, the last one is the change failure rate. So how often does making a change cause an outage in the first place? And you can see there that pretty amazing differences in numbers there. The elite performers, 0 to 15% of the time, making a change in your production environment, doing some type of a deployment causes a problem. Compare that with 60% on the opposite end. That's pretty dramatic. And in fact, here's another diagram that they have in the State of the DevOps report that shows you, and I'm going to pick the largest number here, is that the mean time to recover from incidents, the elite performers are 2,600 times faster than the low performers. So these are really great things to aim for. So they've done the work of tying these IT practices to business outcomes. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, I'll remind you that GitOps was this. And what I want to do now is I want to put those two things together. And in putting those two things together, what I'm going to start with is on the left-hand side here, you can see those measurable IT metrics. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there's some additional cross-cutting concerns, things like security, change control, regulatory compliance. That those things are kind of implicit in some of the things on the left-hand side, but I find it very helpful to continue thinking about those things as we go through the dialogue. Now, you'll also notice that I don't only have 4 things on the left, I have a 5th one, which is availability. And this is something that the folks in this State of the DevOps report call out as a special category. And I won't go into the details of why. We're just going to talk about these things as we go. And so what I want to do now is in the middle, I want to start taking some very specific things that you can do in your IT system. And for each one of those things, I'm going to tie it to GitOps. And so what you can see here is that I have 5 things that we're going to talk through, and they map to those things on the left-hand side as follows. Let's take application team productivity, for example. If you have productive application teams, that is, you're moving things out of the way that have historically plagued them from being able to do some of the behaviors that we know generate higher business outcomes, then what you're doing is you're looking for things that are going to allow them to reduce the lead time and increase their deployment frequency. And what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to go through this as well as 4 other categories and show you specifically how GitOps contributes to application team productivity. When GitOps contributes to that productivity contributes to lowering lead times and increasing deployment frequency. Another thing is that application teams that are autonomous are also able to lower their lead time and increase their deployment frequency. No longer are they dependent on somebody else to deploy something into production. And that's how we're getting to these massive differences, is that the app teams are able to do production deployments instead of having a ticketing process to do so. The third thing is that we want to implement some safety nets, and I'm going to show you exactly the safety nets that, at least a couple of the safety nets that the GitOps process provides. And when you have those safety nets, that allows you to feel a little bit more confident on deploying more frequently. Because if something does start to go wrong, there's a safety net to catch you, to keep you from doing something completely catastrophic. And that also, those same safety nets are going to decrease the change failure rate as well. Repeatability is absolutely essential. And that is, if you will, the first thing that people tend to think of when it comes to GitOps, is they think about repeatability. Now you'll notice that it's just the 4th thing on the list. Of course, it has an impact on deployment frequency, so that I can, for example, if it's just a simple repeatable process, if I'm pushing a button or doing a git push and that has the effect of automating the entire deployment, well, then I can do it very, very frequently because I've got that repeatability, which means that if something does go wrong while I'm doing my deployment, I can just repeat the previous deployment. That also plays a big role in reducing the change failure rate. And then it is the biggest thing in mean time to recovery. When I told the story of Weaveworks and how GitOps was born, it was exactly that. We suffered an outage, but because we had been putting these practices in place, our time to recovery was very, very short. And then finally, how do you get availability? Well, at the root of all availability is redundancy. So that how we surface that redundancy, of course, makes a difference. But if you want to be available all the time, you've got to have more than one of something. Gone are the days where we said, oh, we are going to make sure that this system never goes down, this system being a singleton. Instead, what we're all about is we are all about making sure that we have multiples of those. Okay, so let's drill into the application team productivity bucket then. And I'm going to continue going back to this diagram where I showed some of the mechanics earlier. I'm going to keep going back to this diagram over and over and overlaying some of the GitOps practices and overlaying the benefits of those GitOps practices against those metrics that I just talked about earlier. So if we take a look at this process, remember that the developer process is on the far left-hand side of this. We have the developer and the DevOps engineer. They're already familiar with things like Git, and they're familiar with things like CI process. And not only are they familiar with checking things into Git, but they're also familiar with some of the constructs that are available in Git and some of the Git offerings like GitHub and GitLab and Bitbucket and those types of things like a pull request. So they've been using pull requests to manage their source code control process. They are able to use those same constructs like a pull request in managing their application configuration. So now that change control process that we were talking about earlier that used to be file a ticket and then somebody in some other group goes ahead and does some review and things like that, they're integrating, they're taking that very important IT process and they're realizing it through familiar tools like the pull request. Those of you who know Git know that there's all sorts of other automation that can be tied to Git that do things like, okay, when it does come time for somebody to review that, do they have to go into some arcane web UI and click on some approval box or something like that? No, in many cases, it's just a matter of responding on a thread that is tied to a pull request with looks good to me, / looks good to me. And that has the effect of having a bot at the back end that pushes forward that process. So some of these processes that the development teams have been using, that they've become very efficient around, what we're doing with GitOps is we're saying, don't learn a whole new tool set. Don't have to install a whole new tool set. Just use the tool set that you live in and day out, and use that not only to manage your source code, but to manage your deployments as well, your application configuration. So what that allows us to do is that allows us to really constrain the world that the developer and the DevOps engineer works in. One of the things that's happened, and I've been working in the Kubernetes space for about 3 years now, is that developers, when they started working on Kubernetes, they had to start learning a whole bunch of Kubernetes. They had to learn about daemon sets and deployments and replica sets and config maps and secrets and all of those types of things. And what this does, in fact, is it allows the developers to maybe set up, if we go all the way back to that stack diagram that I showed at the very beginning, it allows developers to kind of live in that application space and not be concerned with all of the details. And so what we're going to do then is that the platform is going to automate everything else for them. Now, in a moment, I'll say a little bit more about how that platform automation happens. But really, what we're talking about here was application team productivity. And by constraining the world that they need to live in, and using tools they're familiar with, we absolutely increase their productivity, which contributes directly to a reduction in lead time and an increase in deployment frequency. Okay, so now let's move on to the next bucket, which is application team autonomy. And I'm going to take you back to this picture. These teams, even though they're using similar processes, and they are both technologists and they're both an iteration and feedback, and the platform team is all about making sure that that organization stays out of the negative headlines on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. We do not want an Equifax. We do not want any kind of other, Target breach or Home Depot breach or anything like that. We don't want to be on the front page. So that's what the platform team is responsible for. So the autonomy that I'm talking about here is, to a large extent, allowing the application teams to not have to go to the platform team for every step of the process. So how do we achieve that autonomy? Now, you remember this picture, right? And remember that I called out earlier that there were different version histories. So I'm going to expand that a little bit. Of course, the image repository is still there, but it's off the screen for a moment. We've got different version histories. What this picture allows us to do then is it allows the developer to stay here, and it allows the platform team to also apply the GitOps process for their side. Now, they're concerned with security and compliance, and it's those configurations that implement exactly the platform automation that is allowing the developers and the DevOps engineers to be more productive, that's shielding them from the details that are happening at the back end. So to sum this up, the platform engineer is responsible for all of the configuration that drives the platform and tooling the security and compliance regulations into that platform. And so let me give you a very concrete example. I was just chatting with a client recently where they have a security process where every single week they get a new version of the base operating system. Now, the base operating system, of course, in a Kubernetes environment is running on the host. What that means is that the platform engineer can simply make available a new machine image and have that deployed onto the hosts in the Kubernetes environment. And they go through and they do a rolling upgrade of all the nodes in the Kubernetes environment. Is there a reason that the developer needs to be involved? Well, that depends. If the developers are building cloud native applications that have been designed for these types of infrastructure quicksand, which again is what my book is all about, is those design patterns that allow you to do that, then the developer doesn't even need to know. The application team doesn't even need to know that this is happening. And there are organizations out there that have it implemented in this case. Now, if they have stateful apps, then there's other things that need to happen and it gets a little bit more complex. But in many, many cases, increasingly in the modern software that we're building today, we can do that. So that application team autonomy then allows them, of course, again, to reduce their lead time and increase their deployment frequency. Now, I'm going to say more about the platform engineer as we go on through the rest of the conversation and look at some of the other elements. All right, so next let's talk about safety nets. So if we go back to our schematic here, I'm sure that you can all pick out the first safety net. And yep, sure enough, it's that version history. Because every node, and I'm going to stick with Git as an example here, has the entire system stored. And this is something that I believe that the folks who created Git had a tremendous foresight, even if they weren't thinking ahead to application configuration. The fact that they weren't storing diffs, as happened with so many source code control systems before, means that you can very, very quickly go back and really, you're just changing a pointer You do not need to replay a whole bunch of diffs to get to a state. You're really just shifting a pointer. And so that's what it means to just be able to roll back a deployment, is that let's say during a rollout process of some new piece of software, I have my application configuration in there. And let's say maybe it's not even that I've changed the artifact. Maybe the image is exactly the same. I'm just changing my configuration. For some reason, I apply that new configuration. I'm going through the process of doing that rollout. Everything goes fine, but then something goes belly up. And these types of things happen all the time. I very quickly want to go back to what had been stable yesterday. And to do that, it's really just a matter of changing a pointer in Git. You can change that pointer, and then you can actually make that the change, so you can move the previous commit to be the head. So there's a question of, is it roll back or roll forward, and we don't need to get into the details of that. But the whole point is that I have expressed the previous version, and I can roll back to that very, very easily. So that's one safety net, and you can imagine how that can give me a lot of confidence in rolling out deployments, and so I'm not going to be so scared. One of the reasons that deployments didn't happen very often before was that they were scary. And if I can make them less scary, then I'm more likely to do them more often. Now, there's a second place that safety nets show up in this diagram, which is right over here on the right-hand side. And that is, there is a notion called progressive delivery. That's a term that was coined by James Governor of RedMonk. And what progressive delivery says is that we are going to, instead of doing a full-scale replacement of version 1 of software with version 2 of software, what we're going to do is we are going to use things like traffic switching and traffic routing to start to send some traffic over to the new version. And that's going to be the proverbial canary. And we're going to keep an eye on that. And if things are going well, we will continue with that deployment. And if things start going haywire, then we will roll back to the previous deployment. Now, why have I painted this picture on the right-hand side? Well, that's because notice that what I just said. I said that it involves things like traffic switching and traffic routing. So that's something that's happening in your target runtime system. So when I talk about this category of software agents that are maintaining correct system state and alerting on divergence and things like that, something like a continuous delivery, progressive delivery process can be implemented in automation to be one of those agents that's running in the software system, responding to the desired state that's on the left-hand side, but doing so in a very safe manner. And I'll draw your attention to one of our open source projects. We have an open source project called Flagger, which implements exactly this. It's implemented as a Kubernetes controller, so you deploy it as an operator into your Kubernetes cluster, and then you get the benefit of this particular safety net. So when we have those safety nets, again, tying that back to the IT practices, the measurable IT practices, is that having those safety nets absolutely, again, is going to allow me to do more frequent deployments. And also, if I start to do a deployment and something goes wrong, I'm going to be able to very, very quickly stop that deployment. And so the deployment won't ultimately fail because I'll still have version 1 of the system running. And now all my traffic is going back to version 1. So that contributes directly to that. All right, we're almost done here. Let's talk about repeatability now. So repeatability, again, I'm going to go back to this diagram, and let's see where repeatability comes in. First of all, remember that one of the principles of GitOps is that we have the entire system declared and stored in a version history. So I've put an asterisk here to just draw your attention to entire system. So if your system, you suffer some type of a meltdown, and 50% of your system is declared and can be recovered through this GitOps process by simply reestablishing a GitOps runtime, reestablishing the target environment, pointing to the GitOps runtime to that target environment. And that GitOps runtime, of course, is also pointing to the repositories that are storing your versions in your entire state of the system. Then it's just a matter of that automation going through and doing things. But if only 50% of your system is set up that way, and the other 50% requires some operator to go to this panel over here and drop this file over here and do this other thing over here, then your mean time to recovery is going to go through the roof. But if you have the more of your system that you have defined in using these GitOps principles, the more immediately and automatically recoverable you are. So that one's not a stretch at all. Now, there's another element, and I'm going to draw your attention here, which is to this composition and synchronization. Now, this picture shows the arrow going from left to right. And in fact, if I had a moment, I would update this picture very quickly. But in fact, it also has this little blue arrows going in both directions. And that's what I've put the asterisk on right now, which is to say, okay, well, wait a minute. If I start to get some drift in my system, and here's my little icon, here's my either intentionally bad actor or my inadvertently bad actor who's coming in and doing something in the production system without having committed that into the Git repository. Now your system, your entire system, isn't captured in that entire system declaration on the left-hand side anymore. Your running system is in fact partially defined by something that somebody has done on the cluster manually. And what we call that drift. What that delivery process does is it's not only delivery, but it's actually a synchronization that guards from risk and identifies when there's been a drift, and then can do one of many things. It can either eliminate that drift and say, you know what, I'm just going to continually revert my system, my target system, back to what you have in the Git repository. And we have lots of people who are doing that automatically. And maybe alert at the same time, because if somebody is doing something that has the risk of causing drift, you want some alerts on that. Or maybe it doesn't do the automatic rollback, the reconciliation, but at the very least, it sends out an alert where somebody can come in and say, what the heck is going on? Who has keys to my target environment? So it might even just be, something that helps with security. So that is a way that that we contribute to those IT outcomes. Now, there's another IT outcome that I didn't have on the slide that I want to talk to here as well, and that is that our platform teams and our infrastructure teams are also responsible for keeping costs from spinning out of control. And there, what repeatability does to contribute to cost control is it basically says, if you think about why application teams hung on to environments before, was really a couple of reasons. One was it was hard to get those environments, and hopefully you're not too terribly plagued by that anymore. But even when that went away and it was easy to self-service an environment, they hung on to those systems because, you know what, the state of that system had some important information in it. If the state of your system is entirely captured in a Git repository, in a set of repositories, then that live cluster or that live target environment is no longer the only expression of that state. And so you will be much more likely able to get rid of those old environments because everything that's contained in those environments is contained in your Git repositories. So I have spoken with users who have implemented automatic harvesting of target environments that haven't been touched in a month because they have the GitOps process in place. And they know that their application teams have everything stored in their Git repositories. That's what allows them to recover some of that unused infrastructure, because in the event that the development team needs it again, the app team needs it again, they can just get it back. All right. So moving on to our final category here, which is redundancy. We know that redundancy is absolutely essential for providing availability. Now, if we go back to this picture, It's not going to be a stretch at all for you to see where I'm going with this. I'm just going to move a few labels around to make some space. But you can imagine here that not only am I doing this deployment into a single data center, but now I'm doing this deployment into multiple data centers. So I can consistently deploy the same environment from one environment, and it might not be different data centers, but different failure domains. Now, this is one of those places where composition is really important again, because part of what we're doing here is that these different failure domains aren't identical, right? They might have different IP ranges, or they might have some other configuration values that differ. And so as a part of the delivery process, we need to instantiate some of the templates that we have stored as a part of our entire system expression on the left-hand side. So this is an important part that really gets me redundancy. So to sum it up, those 5 different things that I talked through in the middle contribute directly to the measures on the left-hand side and even some of the cross-cutting concerns on the right-hand side. So that hopefully gives you a perspective on how GitOps contributes directly to the business value of your organization. Now, let me close. First of all, I know that was an awful lot. And I'm delighted to be sitting on the Slack channel as you're watching this presentation, answering your questions. I also encourage you to reach out to me even after the fact, after the Slack channel is closed down or the conversation has died away. I would love to chat with you further about these conversations. There is so much more to GitOps than there seems to be. Like I said, it's not just the last step in CI. So let me sum up then for you what GitOps is and the value that it brings. First of all, it's a paradigm. It's a paradigm that's not tied to any singular technology, though tools are essential for realizing it. So when I talk about these practices, it's essential that you have reconcilers, both at the delivery level and at the operational level. It's essential that you have tools that allow you to store a version history so that you can just change a pointer to get a different deployment. So the tools and careful selection of tools is important, but it isn't a singular technology. You don't buy GitOps and just by buying, Git, for example. And GitOps applies to everything, not just the cloud native applications, but Kubernetes clusters. So we are GitOps in Kubernetes clusters where you can have a declarative configuration of what you want your Kubernetes cluster to look like. We have the Git delivery process, and then the software agent that is keeping things. It is targeting infrastructure. It's not targeting Kubernetes. It's targeting infrastructure. And that reconciler, yep, you might be guessing it, is something like Cluster API. And all of this is with the goal of delivering real business value. And that's what we spent the latter half of the conversation talking about. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Again, it is so good to be here with you at TechStrong Con. And so good to be chatting with you in the back channel on Slack. And I look forward to chatting with many of you more in the future. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Okay, hope you enjoyed that video from Cornelia Davis from back in June at TechStrong Con. It's more relevant today than it was then, even as GitOps continues to grow, and many thanks to Cornelia for that. Now it's time where we do the news. Headlines around the media ops community sites. Let's jump right to it. At DevOps.com, we have a report that as working from home took hold, few adjusted their security posture. This is something we've discussed on our CISO Talk video series as well. And it's been a bit of a lag because I think the rush was to get it up and running, not necessarily securely with work from home. But it's something we need to concentrate on going forward, and I think we will see more and more around that. Also, we have considered data ops for a competitive edge. I think data ops, again, we see it more and more popping up as something that you need to be focused on. Envoy Proxy Server Project comes of age, about the Envoy Proxy Server Project. And then a survey surfaces impact of COVID-19 on DevOps teams. You know, for the most part, I think we've done well, but take a look at the survey. There's some interesting things there, or maybe things that we could do better or we're not doing better. Over on Container Journal, we have 5 questions for telcos to consider, or in considering, a cloud-native, edge-defined future. And, you know, I think telcos really need to wrap their heads around this. Also on Container Journal, Cisco expands scope of Kubernetes networking ambitions. And that's going to be an interesting play, the whole network, software-defined networking around Kubernetes and everything else. Over on Security Boulevard, a report that China's Chinese Communist Party-driven global threat actor. Go read about that one. And then we have data privacy and COVID-19, what you need to know. And then finally, Sonride defines next phase of DevSecOps. New company launching, or new DevSecOps play launching, you know, up on Security Boulevard. That's going to do it for the news today. As usual, it's just some headlines. Go check the sites out. There's great articles. But for now, we're going to head over to our managing editor, Charlene O'Hanlon, with a great interview today, as well as a preview of this week's webinars on Media Ops. Charlene, take it away.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to TechStrong TV. I am Charlene O'Hanlon, Managing Editor at Media Ops, and I'm here now with Larry Gordon, who was the co-founder and CEO of a company called XOps, which is, as I understand, a global IT services company that really focuses almost exclusively on DevOps. So, Larry, thanks so much for taking a couple minutes and talking with me today. Appreciate it.
Hey, I'm delighted to be here, and good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. It is morning, isn't it? So I'm really excited about this conversation because we're going to be talking about a topic that is not exclusive to DevOps. It's actually a conversation that I think a lot of organizations are having these days, and that is the topic of inclusivity and diversity in the workforce. And I think, you know, interestingly enough, that COVID has actually kind of brought the topic into full focus for a lot of organizations. You would think it would be the exception or the opposite, since the workforce is not in the actual office. But I would imagine that you know, especially with what's happening society-wise, you know, a lot of companies are kind of taking a second look at how they approach hiring and employing a diverse workforce. So, would really love to get your thoughts on this topic and you know, how you guys go about doing it. So, Larry, what do you you know, what do you see happening out there right now, and what do you think, you know, maybe needs to change?
So at XOps, we're a very practical group. We build stuff. We build infrastructure as code. So, you know, when I talk about this, I talk about it, you know, how does it help my clients and my customers? And how does it help my employees? And how does it help our little company? So the first thing I'd like to talk about is how does it help my clients? Because we're very client focused. So we have to provide solutions to them. And since we're DevOps people, often we have to look for solutions in many parts of a technology stack and many parts of an organization. So we need people from diverse backgrounds that we put together in small teams to build things for clients and to solve their problems and to make their IT operations run more effectively. Mm-hmm. So the key thing to being part of our team is that you have to be able to work with people of different backgrounds and different skill sets and have patience and communicate well. So we seek people with diverse backgrounds to work here and to put together on teams. Now, that's technologically diverse, front end, back end, security, deployments, et cetera. But also if we get culturally diverse people, so people from underrepresented groups in technology, and specifically that's women, that's people of different religions, different races, different colors, different outlooks, people who are handicapped, people who are not handicapped. If we start with, we want to recruit people who are empathetic and understand and able to communicate with people who are not exactly like them, we get better solutions technologically and organizationally for our customers. So, and I always like to talk about theory and practice with a little bit of a story too. So I started my IT career and my software career a while ago. And one of the things that was, a big theme in Information Week and Computer World, the leading journals of the day, was the business would go to IT and say, I need this built. And the business culture was so different than the IT culture. And the IT culture would make insular decisions on, I don't want to build that, I don't want to do this, just talking amongst themselves. And they were a pretty close-knit, non-diverse team. And the business tended to be more diverse, and the business wouldn't get the solutions they need because they couldn't break down that cultural barrier, let alone the data barriers and the IT barriers, to building an application that would save the business money or bring in revenue. And in DevOps, right, the reason we exist is because applications have to be rolled out reliably and quickly and securely because they build wealth and revenue. So what happened back then was IT lost budget and lost power to the business because they weren't talking in language and delivering solutions that reflected what the business was doing. So some of us may remember that, but the point is there was a culture in IT that didn't allow them to do business better. And we don't want to fall into that same trap now. We want tech culture and tech representation to reflect business and revenue generating representation. So one thing that happens is we think we deliver solutions based on a more diverse employees. The other way it works is we're small. We're not Cognizant. We're not Accenture. We're not Chase Manhattan Bank. So we have to play Moneyball. If anyone remembers the book and the movie, you find really talented people who are undervalued by the general, population of buyers. So we've been able to find people who are really talented, but who were neglected because they come from underrepresented groups and not necessarily comfortable at a JP Morgan Chase or a big consulting firm. Or, well, no, I don't want to pick on Chase. A big bank. Or a big, right. Right? Because Chase is very good, but others aren't quite as good. So we're able to hire those people and provide great solutions for customers because they're really happy to work for us, and we're able to attract them because we have a workplace that allows them to use their skills to greatest effect. So it helps us in recruiting and finding talent, overlooking the, in the Moneyball sense, be a pitcher who doesn't look like the classic left-handed, pitcher's supposed to look like.
Right. Okay. I wonder if because of the fact that we're all working from home these days because of the pandemic, do you think that the conversations are being had at organizations more or less now that the workforce is largely remote? I mean, taking into account obviously what's happening with the Black Lives Matters movement and basically shining a spotlight on these underrepresented groups. Are we still having the conversations at the proper cadence now that we are mostly remote?
So I'll relate client experience. So let's pick a big bank in New York, and they're all working from home, and it's New York, and it's global, so it's a pretty big. Sure. It's diverse in any case. they are specifically dedicating Zoom meetings to open conversations and sort of inclusive conversations and talking directly about Black Lives Matter and directly about representation and diversity, and are people comfortable, and are people comfortable working at home, and what do you need, and addressing these topics head on. Mm-hmm. Is it an awkward conversation? Incredibly so. And people get uncomfortable listening to others talk about, the way they interpret what's going on. But I know they're having the conversations. Are they effective? Couldn't tell you, not my business. Mm-hmm. Don't know how it's affecting how they do business. But I know people are being asked to carve out time from risk analysis and, credit and SEC compliance, et cetera, to have these conversations. And it's not easy for some of these people.
Yeah, I know in obviously in any space, but the tech space, there are inherent biases that come along with pretty much anybody in any particular organization and any department. People always bring a personal bias into whatever they do and wherever they go. Do you think in the tech space, do you think that that's kind of a different barometer, if you will, from other vertical markets? Because I kind of feel like the tech space is more open and inclusive and welcoming to people of different gender, both men, women, and binaries, and LGBTQs, and people of color, people of different races, nationalities. It certainly has a level of diversity that I just don't see in some other vertical spaces. So, do you agree with me? I mean, is tech kind of farther along than maybe some others?
So, one, tech, of course, is a more global industry than many and has quickly become global. Mm-hmm. So I think that helps. Tech has, geographical densities in the United States, but still it's pervasive throughout the country. And my bias is to agree with you. But when the other people I speak with hear me agree, they correct me and they say, no, we need women in tech, women who code. We need to be mentors to women who are coming up. We, in our little company, have mentors specifically for the women. And they say, no, Larry. And I'm open-minded. So they're good, smart, talented people. And I think they feel it needs to change and needs to improve. That's the message I get from them. Mm-hmm. I tend to live in my own little, world, and I like to hear from them. So there are programs and there are people who are attempting to change. Now, having said that, to go back to my original story of, IT wouldn't help them, because we all remember the big bro culture and the Silicon Valley movies and working there. And it was a little weird. And as a manager, I'm like, I don't know that my daughter or wife wants to work in this dev group. They're awfully good and they're high powered and they're well educated and they work hard. It's a little kooky. So
like a fraternity, right?
Fraternity.
Yeah.
And you can't have that, based on the things I said before on who the customers are and how you get things done quickly. I want to agree with you, but I can't.
Well, I guess it's okay to disagree with me on that. But Larry, thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it. I'd love to see changes, obviously, more changes in equality and in inclusivity and diversity in the tech space and in every space. So I hope that organizations are at least having a conversation. So thanks again for your time. Really do appreciate it.
Sure, Charlene. Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks. You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, everybody, please stay tuned. We've got lots more TechStrong TV coming up, so please stick around.
Disruption is occurring across every aspect of IT. Open source, cloud services, DevOps, and cloud-native software architectures are democratizing IT and radically transforming how business is done. The old ways of creating software and doing IT are being replaced with agile, flexible, faster, and cheaper methods, benefiting vendors and users alike. Accelerated Strategies Group is out to democratize access of industry expertise and knowledge. We use our expertise and experience to offer insightful, intelligent, useful information in a variety of formats relevant to the IT community, digital events, videos, reports, assessments, workshops, and implementation projects with tech vendors, IT organizations, and business leaders. We widely and openly share our work products, often for free. Analyst reports these days aren't worth more than a graph or chart that tells a story or illustrates a market trend. We work with developers, DevOps teams, cloud architects, security engineers, and transformation leaders most every day, creating and implementing transformational strategies and technologies. We're not just thinkers, we're also doers.
Editor at Media Ops, and I'm here now with the Monday version of the webinar previews. We have so many great webinars coming up both on DevOps.com and Security Boulevard, so wanted to take this opportunity to let you know about some of the ones that we have coming up this week. The first one I wanted to let you know about is happening on Security Boulevard. It is called Garmin versus Wasted Locker, Cyber Resilience Lessons from the Biggest Cyber Attacks of 2020. This webinar is being sponsored by Immersive Labs, and it's happening September 1st at 11 a.m. Eastern on Security Boulevard. The webinar, I think it sounds really, really cool. What they're going to do is actually kind of walk us through a simulated cyber attack incident. It was actually inspired by the Garmin ransomware incident that happened a couple months ago. They're going to talk about some of the lessons learned. They're going to talk about kind of the, not just the technological element, but also the human element of ransomware attacks, and really kind of help organizations better understand what a ransomware attack actually includes and how organizations can get beyond the attack to get back to business. Again, this one is happening September 1st at 11 a.m. on Security Boulevard. The second webinar I want to let you know about is happening on DevOps.com. This one is also September 1st. This one is at 1 p.m. Eastern on DevOps.com. It's called Improving the Reliability of Financial Services with Chaos Engineering, sponsored by Gremlin. Now, Gremlin is all about chaos engineering, that is. And so this webinar, they're going to be discussing how it can be used in the FinServ space to increase development velocity while mitigating the risk of failures, among other things. So really, really kind of interesting. I think it's going to be going to have some really great takeaways for anybody in any vertical market, not just financial services, and it's a great use case for chaos, in my opinion. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for this one. The third webinar I want to let you know about is happening on Wednesday, September 2nd at 11 a.m. Eastern on DevOps.com. It is called The Bumpy Road to Actionable SLOs. It's sponsored by Instana. Now, we've been talking about service level objectives for a very long time, and it sounds great, but many organizations are recognizing that it's easier said than done. It can be very, very difficult to achieve the SLO methodology, and as a result, a lot of companies fail in their efforts. Instana is going to kind of walk through companies, some of the pitfalls that companies might encounter in their SLO methodology implementations, and ways that they can move beyond those pitfalls to actually make the SLOs work for them so that they can attain a higher level of maturity. Totally worth checking out if you have had any issues at all with your service level objectives, and or if you just want to find ways to improve on them. All right, that's all the webinars that I'm going to tell you about today. I hope you can join me tomorrow for the next edition of the webinars preview. Until then, please stay safe and have a great day.
Thanks, Charlene. Great webinar preview, as well as a great interview there. with XOps. Up next, we've got Mike Vizard in Channel Roundup, and Mike has the CEO of StackRox to discuss challenges in container security. Here's Mike Vizard.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey, thanks, Alan. We're here with Kamal Shah, the CEO of StackRox. We're talking about all things container security. Kamal, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hey, what is your fundamental opinion about, are containerized applications more secure, less secure, or just generally about as insecure as your standard monolithic application these days?
Yeah, I think first it's important to understand why people are moving away from monolithic applications to microservices, containers, and Kubernetes is because it gives them speed, agility, portability, and instead of driving innovation once every 6 months, you can drive innovation every 6 hours, right? And fundamentally, containers are independent unit of software, and they are contained and they are secure. But it's like anything else. The way you configure and the way you implement these applications also have to be taken into account, because misconfigurations can also drive security issues. Or say you pull up an image from the internet that you're using as part of your application. If that image, has a known vulnerability, then it doesn't matter how secure your containers are, because attackers will find a way to exploit that vulnerability, right? So while containers inherently are more secure, it doesn't take away the responsibility for the developers and the DevOps teams to make sure that you have best practices in place from a security and from a DevOps perspective to minimize risks in your production environments.
Yeah. On the upside, I can rip and replace the container image or maybe the entire microservice more easily than waiting around to patch a monolithic application. On the downside, there could be, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of containers running around that I'm supposed to go check for vulnerabilities inside the code. I mean, is there a process for that? I mean, people talk about DevSecOps, but whose job is that?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest emerging trend right now in the industry, which is DevSecOps. When you think about the number of developers that are, and Mark Andreessen famously said that every company is a software company, and the CEO of Confluent recently said that every company is software, because you're codifying these business processes as software. And as you do that, the pendulum has to shift from a small security team to security becoming everyone's responsibility, because we don't have enough security professionals in the world to keep up with the number of developers that we have in the world, right? And that's what's really driving the movement to DevSecOps, where security becomes everyone's responsibility.
Do you think this shift to containers and Kubernetes in general is going to force the shift to DevSecOps? I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine how you might actually be able to operate without it.
Exactly. It's definitely accelerating the shift to DevSecOps, because in the old world, it took 6 months to develop a monolithic application, and then security teams would come in and bolt security onto that application. In the new world, you're deploying applications every 6 hours, and security has to be embedded or has to be built in as part of that infrastructure. So while containers inherently are secure because they're ephemeral, they're immutable, but it's the configuration of how you deploy those containers, how you manage them through the orchestrator, which is Kubernetes, becomes extremely important.
All right. So is there a set of best practices? Historically, I'm asking this question because we've always taught people about defense in depth, layered security practices. And I wonder if the same thing isn't going to apply on the shift left side, right? We'll give tools to developers, but then there's stuff that has to happen at the CI/CD level. So what is the defense in depth strategy for developers?
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about this cloud native application stack, Mike, and you think about microservices, containers, Kubernetes, the way you had to think about security is in 3 phases. First part is what we call secure the build, which is securing what goes into your applications, right? So if you're downloading any images, making sure that they don't contain known vulnerabilities, right? So securing the build is one important part of the shift left movement that we are seeing in the industry. The second big part of it is securing the infrastructure. So Kubernetes, as you know, has become the de facto orchestrator for cloud native applications, right? It's often referred to as the Linux of the cloud. But Kubernetes has a lot of controls. And if you don't properly configure that infrastructure, then that can lead to misconfigurations, that can lead to breaches, high profile breaches that we've seen at companies like Tesla and Shopify. And then the third piece, even if you do those two things, so you basically, what you've done at this point is made sure all the windows are locked, all the doors are locked, you have an alarm system in place, but that doesn't prevent attackers from breaking into the system, right? And so when they do break it, you also have to then secure your workloads that are running in production. And that's the third piece of it. So securing the build, securing the infrastructure, and securing the workloads. And that gives you a comprehensive defense in depth strategy for your cloud native applications.
What is your sense of awareness of security issues when it relates to containers these days? I feel like we talk a lot about it, but it's not clear to me that developers are getting the message yet, or that we're still waiting for some massive constitutional crisis to happen before everybody starts thinking about this a little more aggressively. Where are we in this maturity journey?
Yeah, like shifts that we see in every industry, the adoption curve is still on the early side, Mike, right? So there is growing awareness around security issues. I think developers are aware of the security issues, and I think they're also becoming more aware that it's part of their responsibility to address them as well. And we're also seeing a greater involvement from the security vendors to shift those controls left and make it easy for the developer to consume this information, right? So imagine if you're a developer, you're working in your CLI tool or CI/CD pipeline, and you're about to go and build a application with a certain set of images. And those images contain known vulnerabilities, right? If you can provide that feedback to that developer in the tools that they use on a daily basis, then they're more likely to understand it because they'll get the information right away. And if you provide the right explanation as to why it's a bad idea to publish this with the known vulnerability with the CVS score of 10 and how to remediate it, then they will of course do it, right? I mean, it's not like they don't want to do it. It's just providing them with the information with what it means, why it matters, why they should care about it, and how to remediate it. And once you do that, we are seeing that developers are embracing it and say, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense, because they know that it's going to save them a lot of headaches at the back end, right? If they design the application and if they build the application with security in mind.
When I talk to security people about this, then in their first 5 seconds, they're excited. They're like, awesome, we're going to get some help. We're undermanned. And then the next breath, they kind of start thinking about it and they go, oh yeah, wait a minute. You're asking me to trust the very people that I've kind of considered to be the enemy of security for the last 2 decades, and that they're developers and they never did the right thing. So how do we get security people on board for this transition?
Yeah, I think what they have to, there has to be a cultural shift, right? We saw this cultural shift, Mike, with the DevOps movement, right? If you recall, there was this chasm between developers and operations teams in the past as well, right? And then they realized that, okay, we need to collaborate and work together, and hence the DevOps movement. Similarly, where we are seeing a DevSecOps movement, where there has to be willingness from all parties involved to be part of the solution, right? So we are seeing companies where they're embedding security personnel as part of the DevOps teams, hence, DevSecOps, right? We are seeing folks with DevSecOps titles, and they don't report up to the product, to the InfoSec or security organization. They're reporting up to the product or engineering organizations, right? So part of it is also infusing security talent inside product and engineering teams and making security a first-class citizen, right? And we are definitely seeing this movement across many of our customers, and that is going to lead to a fundamental change in the way we do security. Historically, security has been challenging because it has been responsibility of the few, and it has been bolted on after the fact. And if you make security a responsibility of all, and if you embed it as part of your existing processes, and you built in as part of your applications, as part of your infrastructure, then it becomes much more permanent. And I think we have a unique opportunity here as we are migrating from monolithic applications to cloud native applications to fundamentally change the way we do security for the better.
All right, this is one of those classic Ronald Reagan trust but verify kind of moments.
It really is. And look, you trust the developers with the right thing. You give them the tools to secure the build process. You put a gates in the deploy process. So make sure you build it correctly. If you deploy it, we're going to check to make sure we're going to verify it before we deploy it in production. And oh, by the way, even after it's deployed in production, because zero-day vulnerabilities do happen, right? And misconfigurations do happen. We'll also make sure that we are monitoring it at runtime. And if you see any anomalous behavior, then we will flag that as well. And then when you flag it, you want to make sure you feed that feedback back to the build and deploy process. So you're addressing issues not just at runtime and get into a whack-a-mole where you fix the same issue over and over again, but you take that information and you fix it in the build and deploy phase so you don't run into the same issue again. Right, and that whole process that's DevSecOps, and that's really what's going to allow us to continuously improve the security posture of our applications.
All right. What ultimately differentiates StackRox then? Because it seems like the space is pretty crowded for something that's just getting started. There's no end of players. So what should people be looking out for when they think about the vendor they want to partner with?
Yeah, I think there are a few tenets that are core to our design principles that we started with. And we strongly believe in that the orchestrator, when you think about container security, the orchestrator is really the control plane, right? And the orchestrator, the de facto orchestrator is Kubernetes. And so over 2 years ago, we made a strategic bet on doubling down on Kubernetes because we fundamentally believe, Mike, that the orchestrator is the control plane for your infrastructure, and it should be where you inject your security controls. It should be a control plane for security as well. And so we made sure that our product was native to Kubernetes, native to the infrastructure, and we leverage all the rich declarative information available in the infrastructure and all the controls available in infrastructure for policy enforcement. Right. So, and what that allows you to do is make sure that you can implement security as code. You are implementing controls that are not colliding with the orchestrator, right? And that really leads to security at scale, and it reduces operational cost and operational risk. Let me give you one simple example of that. If you detect a rogue process that's running, right, and you want to stop that from running, you can leverage Kubernetes to instruct it to say, hey, go kill that pod or go kill that process, right? And when you do that, Kubernetes knows that's a bad process, kill it, I'm going to spool up a new process, and everything works beautifully. And that's our approach. The other vendors, the approach they take is, okay, I'm going to kill that process on the host, on the infrastructure. The moment you do that, Mike, Kubernetes doesn't know that something has been killed. So there's a fundamental misalignment between what's happening at the host and what Kubernetes thinks is happening at the host. And that's what creates massive issues. And that is fundamentally a flawed approach, right? And it's inconsistent with the orchestrator. So our approach in a nutshell is that we are native to the infrastructure. We are native to Kubernetes, hence we call our platform, we distinguish ourselves as being Kube native security. So I hope that makes sense because it shows up across every single use case that we enable for our customers, where the advantages of Kube native security is lower operational cost, lower operational risk, and greater security at scale.
All right. The issue is the left hand will not know what the right hand is doing if somebody else is killing the processes, right?
That is a That's a great way to say it. I wish I had thought of that. So thank you. Exactly. We ensure alignment between the orchestrator and the underlying infrastructure running containers.
Hey, Kamal, thanks for coming on the show.
Mike, thank you as always for having me. Such a pleasure.
All right, guys, back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Mike. Great stuff. All right, it's time now to go over to our analyst corner with Mitchell Ashley, CEO, founder of Accelerated Strategies Group. And Mitchell has some great commentary and video for us. Mitchell, over to you.
Welcome to Analyst Corner. Mitch Ashley, CEO with Accelerated Strategies Group. A lot of things that I pay attention to in the market just because of the kind of work that we do and some of my background in history and security, running IT, network and DevOps and other things. So, but my point being, there's always some interesting activity that tells you, where things, gives you a little hint of where things are going. I've talked before on Analyst Corner, really as a form of encouragement for all of us, because of my experiences going through economic downturns in the past. I know many of you have as well, right? If you've been around long enough, it will happen to all of us, right? And probably multiple times. Certainly the way those cycles go. And, some of those have been pretty painful, nothing like now, certainly not in terms of the loss of life, or the severity of the damage to the US economy, world economy. But a lesson from all those experiences is in that significant disruption comes significant opportunities. Some you have to find, some you create, some are presented to you. And so I'm always looking for how do things shift in the market. And there's really two things I want to talk about. One is to give you an example of a transaction that may not have occurred 6-9 months ago and now is because of that. Cisco announced that they're acquiring Babel Labs, assume it's Babel, not Babel, whatever, however you pronounce that, who has AI software for removing background noise from any kind of video or audio, really. I mean, it could be a meeting, online meeting, obviously. That's what they bought it for WebEx, but Cisco has a huge line of collaboration software, video software platforms and audio services. So I can imagine that they would use it quite a bit, in a lot of their products. So you can certainly see why one investment in technology like that makes sense. Would that have happened 9-12 months ago? Hard to say. It didn't, and it did now. But also the demanding pressures and expectations of customers on existing products like WebEx and online, GoToMeeting, Zoom, and everything else. The customers use it more. They have increased needs, expectations. There's opportunities for more things you can do. You can offer the customer. Matter of fact, out with, it was back in maybe it was pre-June time, they came out with their kind of WebEx meeting hub, basically ability to manage meetings better or more easily for an enterprise. And at that time, I think they said this was June 16th, if I remember right, that they had 25 billion meeting minutes in the month. And it was a 3x change. I mean, that's how much traffic had changed, usage had changed in that short period of time. So massive. I mean, we all love our businesses to increase by 3x. I'm not sure revenue matched that, but the connection and the tie and the on us, a meeting service like WebEx or any of the others is a big plus. But some interesting things I thought happened along with that. I mean, we've had much greater emphasis on security. I mean, you saw issues that Zoom had. Cisco, in their case, came out with some new security features, all of that, things like data loss prevention, retention information, recovery, data about meetings to not only manage it better, but also for compliance reasons, for legal search, legal holds, all of those kind of things. If you run IT, been in that part of IT, depending on your company, those may happen quite frequently. So that, adding new capabilities, they upgraded their encryption, I think, from AES 256 to GCM. Again, kind of up in the game. Maybe some of those were catch-up features. I'm not necessarily lay out which were which, but it helps me understand kind of what's happening, because while that's like a micro event in the system of our economy, system of our technology landscape, there's so many of those things happening all at the same time. I was on a webinar this past week with Alan Shimo, who's CEO of Media Ops, and Rajat Bhargava, who's CEO of GemCloud. He's been CEO of several companies. And actually, Alan and Rajat and I go way back to early 2000 when we worked together in a company called Still Secure, co-founding. We've been in those kinds of investments together, and to some degree worked off and on with each other, probably more Alan and Raj than I have since then. But it was great to get us back together, because we had this point of reference for what had happened in security really over the last almost 2 decades, at least 15 years. And some of the things that's really changed pretty drastically in the market. And it occurred to me, there's kind of a really interesting analogy to what's happened in our world. One being driven by work from home, if you want to take that one thing. And there are others, I believe. But essentially, we've kind of flipped it 180. If you take some percentage of people that were who could work from home but are working in offices, and a much smaller percentage of folks who do work remotely, either work remote full-time, travel, and are remote full-time, whatever it might be. And you kind of flip that 180, and now most people who are able to are working from home in their home offices, or what's been made into a home office. Maybe those percentages not exactly reversed, but certainly flipped. Kind of think of the seesaw flipping from one way to another, and how disruptive that is to a system. I mean, there's an immediate need to equalize, kind of create the new equilibrium, at least to hold things together, continue operating, which can sustain you for quite a while. But at the same time, as that settling out happens, when you change something that drastically, you start to realize that, well, how we thought about doing a meeting, or how we thought about working, or how we thought about leading people, or how we thought about security when we're building it to be network-centric versus distributed device and user-centric, or whatever it might be, that it really is an upending function, and it creates huge opportunities for new companies, new products, and innovation. It also can be really uncomfortable. Disruption sounds like a negative word, because there are some negative consequences to it, but there are also kind of positive to it. And what kind of happens when things shift that much, they change that significantly, is it settles out. I can think of a magnet. How matching north to south ends of the poles on the polarity of two magnets will come back to equilibrium, come back together, and south to south, north to north will push them back the other way around, right? It's looking for what is the place where the connections make sense. Now, in case of a magnet, there's one way it's going to work, right? South to north, north to south. But in our case, that sort of that magnetism of wanting it to bring back to a new place is what creates some new capabilities. And we were talking about, if you were going to design a network, if you're going to design how you're going to do user identity, device identity, access control, some of those kind of things. And when you come out of a network-centric world, where you've built the network as part of your data center, part of your company, and you have things that interface to you, to flip that the opposite way, where I don't have to have a data center. Maybe I do, but a much smaller one. And that changes the dynamics about how you would design that. So you might go with a more distributed option. You might go with a strategy that says, I'm going to assume most applications I'm going to use are not going to be my own. They're going to be SaaS. They're going to be third party. They're going to be cloud services. All right. Now, how do I design whatever it is, my network security, my identity management, directory services, application strategy, integration strategy? Flip it from that opposite direction and see what makes sense that way. If you're going to start that way, how would you do it? And not all of us are starting from a clean slate. Most of us aren't. We've got momentum and things that we've already implemented and decided upon and strategies gone. But we can also still take that idea of let's flip things to be the opposite. And if you were in that situation, what would you do to solve this problem or design this kind of a network or security strategy? And even though we're not exactly in those conditions, those ideas can still potentially apply to where you are, or may move you a step or two downfield, maybe to that direction or not. But it's a great way to kind of innovate, ideate on perspectives, because you need something to get out of the current perspective that you have that, over time, in the music studio, I have a lot of fun doing a little bit of recording here, instrument recording and some vocals and things. And you get ear fatigue. You stop hearing what's happening coming over the monitors, the audio monitors. And you just can only be there for so long, and then you have to step away and let your ears get a rest. That's kind of the same idea. You need to get away from looking at things from the perspective that you've been looking at them. And I've also used that. I don't know how I came upon this. I'm sure it was somebody's idea, and I took it and thought it was mine. But it's also a great way to get unstuck from a problem. Or like every path we go down to try to solve this problem, we run into a dead end, or we run into more problems, or we run into something we can't figure out, or this looks worse than where we were. And oftentimes that same approach of, well, let's take the opposite situation. If we did exactly the opposite, like for example, what if we didn't have a network security strategy or something really ridiculous like that, right? You're not even going to do that. What would you do if you didn't have a centralized network security strategy? Well, okay, I might design things this way and look for these kind of services. And oh, here's an idea. That actually would work for us where we are now. So I hope you get my point. Is this a shifting upheaval and disruption, and this wanting to kind of settle back to where we were, or figure out what the next point of settling, equilibrium looks like? That taking that 180 approach can be something that's super helpful and give you kind of new insights. You may never go that direction that way. It may not even make sense, but there's ideas and things that can be generated by looking at things from a different perspective. So I hope that's helpful. Kind of some interesting insights on the market and fun things that I like to watch, and of course, people that I talk with and companies and such. So a lot of great things happening at Accelerated Strategies, and also at our sister company, MediaOps and DevOps Institute. So all great companies to be working with and reading their content. And we're excited to be doing more work with our customers. We're doing some studies around how software teams work and how that can inform or improve how we collaborate working remotely for the rest of the company. We're getting close to wrapping up some Kubernetes data security research. Both of those things are going on right now, so you can go to the Accelerated Strategies website and be part of our research. We would sincerely appreciate that very much. And we'll be having some deliverables come out of that not too far down the road. And of course, some other things in the works too. We'll talk about those as they get nearer. We have a wonderful day. Be safe, be well, and be careful out there. Have a good day.
Join topic experts and peers for a Splunk virtual event. Observability to enable your digital initiatives. Are your apps and services distributed in the cloud, getting refactored as microservices, or becoming more complex? If they are, you must factor in observability. Observability is all your data to help you find unexpected failure conditions, explain why they happen, and resolve them fast. This event is about the challenges, opportunities, and best practices.
Well, guys, that's going to wrap it up for Monday, August 31st. I hope you've had a good August. We've got another month in the books. I will see you next month, which is tomorrow, for Tuesday, September 1st. Until then, stay well, stay safe, stay strong. TechStrong. This is Alan Schimmel. We're out.